At one point, things got really goth. Charles became obsessed with his ancestors. He ordered the royal crypt in the Escorial to be opened. He went down into the cold marble tombs. He had the coffins of his parents and his first wife opened. He looked at their decaying bodies. He touched them. He wept over the body of Marie Louise. "I will be with you soon," he whispered. It's a scene straight out of a Gothic horror novel. The sickly king, deep underground, surrounded by the dust of his inbred ancestors, longing for death. Finally, in 1700, at the age of 38, which was honestly a miracle he made it that far, Charles II gave up the ghost. His death was a relief to him, but a nightmare for Europe. Because he had no children, the War of the Spanish Succession broke out. It lasted 13 years. Thousands of people died. Maps were redrawn, all because one family tree didn't have enough branches. The autopsy of Charles II is famous. The physician, Dr. Pedro Gargani, wrote that the king's body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. Now, is that medically accurate? Probably not. It sounds more like the doctor was writing a poem about decay. But it paints a picture of a man who was hollowed out by his own lineage. So let's leave poor Charles in his crypt. He's finally resting. No more ambassadors staring at him. No more exorcists yelling at him. No more heavy velvet robes weighing down his frail shoulders. The silence of the Escorial is deep and cool. The stone walls are thick. It's the perfect place to sleep for a few centuries. But we aren't done with royal dysfunction. Oh no, we're just getting started. Because while the Spanish Habsburgs were withering away, other royal families were finding new and exciting ways to be miserable. Let's drift north, across the Pyrenees, across France, across the Channel, to England. We're going to float over to the Tudors. Specifically, we're going to look at the childhood of a king who is famous for dying young, Edward VI, the boy king, the son Henry VIII wanted so badly he broke the church to get him. You'd think being the most desired baby in English history would be a sweet gig, but much like Medusa and Charles, Edward found that being special is usually just a trap. Let's settle in for a story about a boy in a gilded cage, surrounded by uncles who wanted his power and sisters who, well, we all know about Mary and Elizabeth. But first, take a breath. Let the image of the Spanish court fade. The incense smoke clears. We are now in the crisp, damp air of Tudor England. It's 1537. It's October, and Henry VIII is pacing the halls, waiting for a son. We'll pick up that thread in a moment. Just listen to the rain on the roof, the English rain, constant, steady, sleepy. The boy who was scrubbed too much and the Russian orphan. We are floating in the damp, cool air of Tudor England. It's 1537. We are at Hampton Court Palace. The brick chimneys are puffing smoke into the gray sky. Inside, the halls are filled with the smell of roasting meat and anxiety. Henry VIII, a man who takes up a lot of space, both physically and historically, is pacing. He has been waiting decades for this moment. He has divorced one wife and beheaded another, mostly because they kept giving him daughters. Daughters were fine for political alliances, but they couldn't run the company. He needed a son. Finally, his third wife, Jane Seymour, delivered. It is a boy, Edward. The celebrations were massive. Bonfires were lit. Wine flowed in the streets. Te Deums were sung. Henry was ecstatic. He finally had his Prince of Wales. The dynasty was secure. But, as is the tradition in these stories, the arrival of life came hand in hand with death. Jane Seymour, the woman who did the impossible, developed an infection. 12 days after the birth, she died. Henry was sad, sure. He apparently wore black for months. but mostly he was just relieved he had the kid. He looked at this tiny, screaming baby and saw the future of England. And because he had lost so many potential heirs before, he became absolutely paranoid about keeping Edward alive. Edward's childhood wasn't really a childhood. It was a sterile quarantine experiment. Henry ordered that the prince's rooms be scrubbed every single day. In the 16th century, nobody scrubbed anything every day. But for Edward, the floors were washed, the walls were wiped down. No one was allowed to approach the prince unless they were a specific rank. You couldn't just be a servant, you had to be a clean servant. Everything Edward touched was inspected. His food was tasted. His clothes were examined. He was the most protected human being in Europe. He was the precious jewel. Imagine growing up like that. You're a little boy, but you're not allowed to play in the mud. You're not allowed to scrape your knee. You're not allowed to hug anyone who hasn't been vetted by the Privy Council. It's lonely. Edward grew serious. He had no choice. When your dad is Henry VIII, the vibe on dinner is usually tense. Edward was incredibly smart, though. He was learning Latin and Greek before he could properly tie his shoes. He was studying theology while other kids were playing tag. And then, when he was just 9 years old, the inevitable happened. Henry VIII died. The giant oak tree finally fell over. Suddenly, this pale, serious 9-year-old boy was King Edward VI. The coronation was a lot for a kid. They cut the ceremony short because they were afraid he would get tired and cranky. But he sat there, in robes that were too heavy, with a crown that was too big, holding an orb and scepter, looking out at a sea of old men who all wanted to use him as a puppet. Because that's the thing about boy kings. They don't rule. Their uncles rule. Edward had an uncle, Edward Seymour. He became the Duke of Somerset and the Lord Protector. That's a great title. It sounds like a superhero. It really meant the guy who is actually in charge. Somerset was ambitious. He treated the young king less like a monarch and more like an annoying uncle he had to babysit. He kept Edward on a tight allowance. The King of England had to ask his uncle for pocket money, and usually the uncle said no. Edward would write letters to his stepmother, Catherine Parr, complaining that he couldn't even tip his servants because he was broke. It's a very specific kind of royal problem. I own all the castles, but I can't buy a new hat. Edward retreated into his books. He became fanatically religious. He was a strict Protestant. He wanted to strip the churches of all their gold and statues. He was basically a Puritan in a crown. He wrote a diary, which we still have. It's fascinatingly dull. He writes about political executions with the same emotional detachment as he writes about the weather. Today, my uncle was beheaded. It rained in the afternoon. It's chilling. The kid was ice cold. But he was also just a sick child. The Tudor genes were not much better than the Habsburgs. Edward was always frail, and in his teenage years, he started to cough. It was consumption, tuberculosis, the captain of all these men of death.
Real history, unfortunately, is much messier. Real history doesn't have Athena to come down and tidy up the plot holes. Real history just has genetics. And if there is one family that proved genetics is a vengeful god that demands a sacrifice, it's the Habsburgs. Let's drift away from ancient Greece. Let's float forward through the centuries, past the Romans, who were messy in their own way, past the Middle Ages, which were mostly just damp. We're going to land in the 17th century, specifically in Spain. The vibe here is very different. It's not sun-drenched beaches and marble temples. It's heavy velvet curtains, dark palace corridors, the smell of incense and old wood, and a lot of people whispering in corners about the king's health. We're going to talk about Charles II of Spain, or as he was known, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Now, usually when a king is called the Bewitched, you assume it's because he made some dark pact with a warlock or was cursed by a swamp witch. But in Charles's case, the witchcraft was actually just his family tree, which, if you drew it out, wouldn't look like a tree. it would look like a wreath or a tumbleweed. The Habsburgs were the ultimate power couple of Europe. Literally, they married each other constantly to keep their lands in the family. It was a geopolitical strategy. Why marry a stranger when you can marry your cousin and keep the Duchy of Burgundy? It seemed like a good idea on paper. In practice, it was a biological disaster. By the time we get to Charles II, the gene pool was more of a gene puddle, a very shallow, stagnant puddle. Charles was the end of the line. He was the final product of generations of uncles marrying nieces and first cousins marrying first cousins. Let's just look at the math for a second. Very sleepy, non-stressful math. A normal person has 8 great-grandparents. Charles had 4. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandmother was also his aunt. It's the kind of family geometry that makes you want to lie down and close your eyes just to stop the headache. Charles was born in 1661, and right from the start, things were not great. The Spanish court was desperate for a male heir. His father, Philip IV, was getting old. He needed a son. When Charles was born, there was rejoicing. Fireworks, cannons. It's a boy! But the ambassadors who saw the baby were writing letters home that were basically like, uh-oh. The baby was incredibly weak. He had a head that was too big for his body. He had a weak chest, and he had the signature feature of his family, the Habsburg jaw. Now, you've probably seen portraits of Habsburgs. They have that prominent chin, but Charles took it to a new level. His lower jaw jutted out so far that his teeth didn't meet. He couldn't chew. His tongue was too big for his mouth, so he drooled constantly. He barely spoke until he was 4. He didn't walk until he was 8. It's easy to mock the portraits, but honestly, it's just sad. This poor kid was in pain his entire life. He suffered from rickets, seizures, digestive issues. He was basically a walking medical textbook of genetic anomalies. But he was the king. He was the ruler of the Spanish Empire. The sun never set on his dominions, but the sun barely rose on his actual day-to-day life. His childhood was protective, and by protective, I mean suffocating. His mother, Mariana of Austria, who was also his father's niece, don't think about it too hard, was terrified he would die, so she basically wrapped him in cotton wool. They didn't force him to study. They thought education would strain his brain. So the King of Spain, one of the most powerful people on earth, was barely literate. He spent his days playing with dwarfs in the palace gardens. The Spanish court had a fascination with dwarfs and people with physical differences, partly for entertainment, but with Charles, I like to think he just felt comfortable around people who didn't look like the perfect, judgmental courtiers. His hygiene regime was also non-existent. The doctors at the time believed that washing was bad for you. They thought it opened the pores to disease. So Charles was never washed. He was just dusted, like a piece of antique furniture. They would just wipe him down with spices and powders. Imagine the smell of that palace. Heavy tapestries, unwashed bodies, medicinal herbs. It's a very stuffy, drowsy atmosphere. Because he was so fragile, everyone was just waiting for him to die. The French were waiting, the Austrians were waiting. They were all hovering like vultures, checking their watches, ready to carve up the empire. But Charles, against all odds, kept living. He was stubborn. He was the little engine that could, if the engine was falling apart and leaking oil everywhere. He actually got married twice. The first marriage was to a French princess, Marie-Louise of Orléans. She was young, beautiful, and loved to ride horses. When she was told she had to marry Charles II of Spain, she famously said, "Could there not be another way?" There was not. She arrived in Spain and met her husband. It must have been a shot, but surprisingly, they actually got along. Charles adored her. He had probably never had a pretty girl be nice to him in his life. He worshipped the ground she walked on. But the court was miserable for her. It was strict, it was boring, the etiquette was rigid. She couldn't laugh, she couldn't look out the window, and the pressure to produce an heir was immense. Every time she had a stomachache, the court celebrated. "Is it a baby?"
No, it was just the terrible food. They never had children. Biologically, it was probably impossible for Charles. His autopsy later said he had, well, let's just say his internal organs were not standard issue. One doctor described his heart as the size of a peppercorn. It's poetic, but medically confusing. Marie-Louise died young, at 27. Charles was heartbroken. He fell into a deep depression. But the court didn't care about his feelings. They needed an heir. They married him off again, immediately. This time to a German princess, Maria Anna of Neuenberg. She was very different. She wasn't the sweet, sad French girl. She was tough. She had a personality. She arrived in Spain and took one look at Charles and the court and decided she was going to run the place. She terrified Charles. He would apparently hide from her. She would have tantrums. She would break things. She was desperate to have a child because she knew her power depended on it, but it wasn't happening. So she started trying alternative remedies. This is where the bewitched part really kicks in. The king's health was failing. He was going bald, he was losing his teeth, he was hallucinating. The doctors, having run out of leeches and hot pokers, decided that the problem wasn't genetics, it was magic. Obviously. They brought in exorcists, specifically a Capuchin monk who claimed he could talk to demons. They performed exorcisms on the king. They asked the demons who had cursed him. The demons, apparently speaking through the monk, said it was a curse placed on him by his mother, or maybe a chocolate drink he had 10 years ago. The details were fuzzy. Poor Charles believed it. He was convinced he was bewitched. He stopped taking his medicine and started taking magical cures. These included things like keeping a bag of dried vipers under his pillow or drinking crushed pearls.
He turns his head aside. He reaches into the bag, and for the third and final time in this saga, he pulls out the head of Medusa. Polygnotes is mid-laugh, his mouth is open, his eyes are wide, and in that exact expression of mockery, he turns to stone. The entire table follows suit. The nobles, the guards, the servants who happen to be looking. The whole room freezes, the laughter dies in their throats and becomes silence. Perseus lowers the head. He looks at the statue of the king. It's a very ugly statue, but at least it's quiet. He walks out of the palace. He goes to the temple and finds his mom and Dictys. It's safe now, he tells them. The king is indisposed, permanently. He makes Dictys the new king of Seriphos, which is a nice upgrade, from fisherman to monarch in one afternoon. And Dictys was a good guy, so the island probably had a nice, boring few years of prosperity after that. Now Perseus has to return the rental equipment. He gives the winged sandals and the magic bag back to Hermes. He gives the helm of darkness back to Hades via Hermes. And then he turns to Athena. He has the head of Medusa. It's still potent. It's still dangerous. He can't just keep it in his closet. Athena takes it. And this is the part that is truly twisted. Athena, the goddess who cursed Medusa, who made her a monster, who helped Perseus kill her, she takes the severed head and she mounts it onto the front of her own shield, the Aegis. She literally wears her victim as a fashion accessory. It became her logo. If you look at statues of Athena, you'll often see the face of Medusa on her breastplate. It's the ultimate power move. I defeated this, and now I wear it. It's cold, it's divine, it's very corporate. So Medusa, even in death, didn't get to rest. Her face continued to be used as a weapon of terror, frozen on the shield of the goddess who ruined her life. But there is one final loose end. The grandfather, King Acrisius. Remember him? The guy who locked his daughter in a bronze box and threw her into the ocean because he was afraid of a prophecy? The prophecy said his grandson would kill him. Perseus decides he wants to go back to Argos. He wants to meet his grandfather. He's not planning to kill him. Perseus is a hero now. He's chill. He just wants to say, "Hey, I survived. No hard feelings. Let's bury the hatchet." Acrisius hears that Perseus is coming. He hears that Perseus has killed a Gorgon and turned a bunch of people to stone. Acrisius panics. He thinks he's coming for me. So Acrisius flees. He leaves his kingdom and runs away to a city called Larissa in the north. He thinks he can outrun fate. Perseus arrives in Argos, finds the throne empty, and hears that his grandpa went to Larissa. So, being a dutiful grandson, Perseus follows him. He arrives in Larissa just as the city is hosting some funeral games. These are athletic competitions held in honor of a local king who had died. Perseus thinks, "Hey, I'm athletic. I'll join in. It'll be fun." He signs up for the discus throw. A discus is basically a heavy frisbee made of stone or bronze. You spin around and throw it as far as you can. Perseus steps up. He's strong. He's a demigod. He gives it a mighty heave. But as the disc leaves his hand, a gust of wind catches it. Or maybe it was just a bad throw. Or maybe, just maybe, the fates nudged it a little bit to the left. The heavy bronze disc sails off course. It flies into the crowd of spectators, and it hits an old man. It hits him right in the head, or the foot, depending on the version, but the result is the same. The old man falls down dead instantly. Perseus runs over, horrified. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." They check the body. They check the ID. It was Acrisius. He was sitting in the stands, hiding in the crowd, watching the games, and his grandson, without even knowing he was there, killed him with a frisbee. The prophecy was fulfilled. Acrisius tried to prevent it by being a monster to his daughter, and in the end, he died by a complete accident at a sporting event. It's the kind of dark humor the Greeks loved. You can run to the ends of the earth, you can build bronze towers, you can throw babies in the ocean. But if the oracle says you're going to get taken out by your grandson, you're going to get taken out by your grandson, even if he's just trying to win a trophy. Perseus was devastated. He didn't want to kill the old man. He buried him with honor, but he felt too guilty to go back and rule Argos. He felt he couldn't sit on the throne of the man he had just killed. So he did a house swap. He went to his cousin, who ruled the nearby kingdom of Tyrenes, and said, "Hey, want to trade kingdoms? Mine is bigger, but I have bad memories there." The cousin said yes. Perseus and Andromeda moved to Tyrenes. They had a bunch of kids, they founded the city of Mycenae, they lived happily ever after, which is a rare ending for Greek heroes. Usually they end up being torn apart by Maenads or poisoned by robes. But Perseus got a pass. Eventually, when they died, Athena put them in the stars. You can still see them. The constellation Perseus, the constellation Andromeda. Cassiopeia is there too, but she's hanging upside down half the night for punishment for her vanity. And Medusa? There is no constellation for Medusa. No stars, just the image on the shield, just the monsters in the deep, just the snakes in the desert. Her story is the foundation for everyone else's glory. She was the stepping stone, the plot device, the monster who had to die so the hero could look cool. It's a quiet tragedy. So, as you lie there in the dark, think of the silence of the stone statues on the island of Seriphos. Think of the dust settling in the empty banquet hall. Think of the wind blowing over the Atlas Mountains. The noise of the story has faded. The screaming sisters are gone. The hissing snakes are silent. The hero has hung up his sword. Everything is still. Everything is heavy.
just stone and stars. Drift along with that silence. Let the weight of the story press you down into the mattress. It's all ancient history now. None of it can hurt you. It's just old stories, worn smooth with time, like sea glass on a beach. Good night, guys. Sleep well. And try not to look at any strange reflections in the mirror. You never know. From stardust to sawdust, the Habsburg jaw. So we've left Perseus and Andromeda hanging out in the night sky, slowly rotating around the North Star. It's a nice clean ending. Mythology is great like that. When things get too messy, you just turn someone into a constellation or a flower and call it a day.
He hadn't shown up when she was chained to the rock, mind you. He didn't offer to fight the monster. He was suspiciously absent during the danger part. But now that the monster was dead and the girl was safe, he was back to claim his prize. "Stop the wedding," Phineus shouted. "That woman is mine. I have a prior contract." Perseus stood up. He was tired. He had flown across a continent. He had killed a Gorgon. He had turned a Titan into a mountain. He had killed a sea monster. He really just wanted to eat his cake. "You weren't there when she was about to be eaten," Perseus pointed out reasonably. "You abandoned her. I saved her. She's mine by right of rescue." The crowd murmured. They agreed with Perseus. Phineus was being a jerk. But Phineus didn't care about public opinion. He grabbed a spear and threw it at Perseus. He missed because he was angry and bad at aiming. The spear stuck into the couch Perseus was sitting on. That was the signal. Phineus's men drew their swords. The wedding guests, who were loyal to Cepheus, drew their weapons. Suddenly, the wedding reception turned into a riot. Tables were overturned, wine jars were smashed, people were fighting with carving knives and goblets. It was chaos. Perseus was a good fighter, but he was outnumbered. Phineus had brought a lot of guys. They were surrounding him, backing him into a corner. Perseus was deflecting blows with his shield, protecting Andromeda behind him, but there were too many of them. He realized this was going to take too long, and he was really done with fighting. He shouted over the din of battle, "Anyone who is my friend, close your eyes." Andromeda closed her eyes immediately. She knew what was in the bag. King Cepheus and Cassiopeia hopefully closed their eyes too. Perseus reached into the cabesus. He grabbed the snaky hair. He pulled out the head of Medusa. He held it up high. "Look at this," he yelled. The soldiers, Phineus, the rioters, they all instinctively looked. It's human nature. If someone yells, "Look," you look. The noise in the room stopped instantly. One moment there was the clang of metal, the shouting of men, the breaking of pottery. The next moment, silence. Heavy, stone silence. Phineus was frozen mid-shout, his arm raised to throw another javelin. His face was twisted in rage, but now it was gray marble. His soldiers were statues in various poses of aggression. One guy was probably tripping over a table. Now he was a permanent art installation. Perseus lowered the head. He put it back in the bag. He looked around the room. It was now a sculpture garden. A very violent, chaotic sculpture garden. "Well," Perseus said, "that settles that." The wedding was technically over, mostly because half the guest list was now granted, but Andromeda was safe. Perseus was safe. They didn't stay long after that. It was awkward. "Sorry, I turned your uncle into a statue, honey. Ready to go meet my mom?" They packed up their things. Perseus grabbed his magic gear. He took Andromeda by the hand, and they set off for Seriphus. They had to go back to the beginning, back to the island where his mother, Danae, was hiding, back to the evil King Polydectes who had sent him on this suicide mission in the first place. Polydectes was probably expecting Perseus to be dead. He was probably counting on it. He was likely harassing Danae right now, thinking the obstacle was gone. He had no idea that the obstacle was coming back, and he was bringing a very angry girlfriend and a bag with a nuclear weapon inside it. The flight back was long. They crossed the sea again. The wind rushed over the waves, the sun rose and set. Perseus and Andromeda, gliding over the water, leave the ruins of the wedding and the dead monster behind them. It feels like a victory lap, but there is one more stop, one more group of people who need to look into the eyes of the Gorgon, one final act of petrification to tie up all the loose ends. Let's float with them for a while. Imagine the rhythm of the winged sandals beating against the air. Whoosh, whoosh. The silence of the open ocean. The peace of knowing that the hard part is over, and now it's just about settling the score. Medusa is still with them. Even in death, she is the most powerful weapon in the world. Her tragedy has become Perseus's triumph. It's unfair, it's dark, but it's the story. We'll land on Seriphus in the next part. We'll walk into the king's hall one last time, and we'll see what happens when a king gets exactly what he asked for. The stone dinner party and the accidental discus. So, Perseus and Andromeda finally land on the island of Seriphus. It's been a long trek. They are probably jet-lagged, sunburnt, and just want a shower. But the work is not quite done. When they arrive, the vibe on the island is bad. Perseus goes looking for his mother, Danae, and his foster dad, Dictys, the fisherman. He doesn't find them in the nice fishing hut where he grew up. He finds out they've gone into hiding. It turns out, while Perseus was away fighting monsters, King Polydectes showed his true colors. Once he thought Perseus was out of the picture, he started harassing Danae again. She and Dictys had to flee to a temple for sanctuary. It's a cruel irony. The story started with Medusa fleeing to a temple to escape a predator, and now Perseus's mother is doing the exact same thing. History doesn't repeat itself, but in Greek mythology, it definitely rhymes. Perseus is furious. He tells Andromeda, "Wait here, I have to go to a meeting." He marches up to the palace. He's still carrying the magic bag. He's still wearing the winged sandals. He looks like a guy who has seen some things. He bursts into the banquet hall. Polydectes is there, surrounded by his sycophants and nobles. They're eating, drinking, and probably making jokes about how Perseus is definitely dead. Remember that kid who thought he could kill a Gorgon? What an idiot. Pass the grapes. Then Perseus kicks the door open. The room goes quiet. Polydectes stares at him. He looks like he's seen a ghost, but then his arrogance kicks back in. He sneers. "Look who's back," the king says. "The little fisherman. Did you give up? Did you run away? Where's my gift, boy?" The nobles laugh. They think this is hilarious. They think Perseus is empty-handed. Perseus doesn't yell. He doesn't make a speech. He's too tired for speeches. He just looks at the king and says, "I brought you exactly what you asked for, but you might want to shield your eyes." Polydectes laughs harder. "You a liar. You didn't kill the Gorgon." "Okay," Perseus says. "Have it your way."
Sarah Winchester is a widow. Her husband was William Wirt Winchester, the heir to the rifle fortune, the gun that won the West. Sarah was grieving. She had lost her husband and her infant daughter. She went to a medium because in the 19th century that was the therapy of choice. The medium told her, "You are cursed. The ghosts of everyone killed by a Winchester rifle are coming for you. You must build a house for them, and you must never stop building. If the hammers stop, you will die." Now, a rational person might say, "That sounds expensive." Sarah Winchester said, "Okay." She bought a farmhouse and started construction. For 38 years, the construction never stopped, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But she didn't hire an architect. She designed it herself, allegedly guided by spirits during seances. The result is the Winchester Mystery House, and it is a nightmare of architecture. There are staircases that go nowhere, ending abruptly at the ceiling. There are doors that open into solid walls. There are windows in the floor. There is a door to nowhere on the second floor that opens directly to the outside, a 2-story drop to the garden. Hopefully, the ghosts can fly.
She built rooms inside of other rooms. She was trying to confuse the ghosts. She thought if the layout was weird enough, the angry spirits would get lost and couldn't find her bedroom. She slept in a different room every night to evade them. She had a fixation on the number 13. Chandeliers with 13 candles, windows with 13 panes, 13 hooks in the closet. She spent her entire fortune, millions of dollars, on lumber and glass. In 1906, the Great San Francisco earthquake hit. The house was damaged. Sarah was trapped in one of her bedrooms for hours because the door jammed. She decided the spirits were angry that she had finished the front of the house, so she boarded it up and never fixed it. She died in her sleep in 1922. The moment she died, the carpenters stopped. They literally dropped their hammers. There are nails left halfway driven into the wood. The silence that fell on that house must have been deafening. After 38 years of constant banging, sawing, and hammering, just silence. Today, it's a tourist attraction. You can walk through the doors that lead to nowhere. You can feel the weird, claustrophobic energy of a woman who spent 4 decades running from invisible guilt. It's a monument to fear, a giant wooden panic attack. So lie there and be glad your house makes sense. Be glad your stairs lead to a floor. Be glad your doors don't open into a brick wall. Let's drift to one final eccentric for this segment. Someone who loved animals, a little too much. The 4th Duke of Portland, William John Cavendish Scott Bentinck. He lived in the mid-19th century at Welbeck Abbey in England. He was extremely shy, painfully shy. He didn't want anyone to see him, ever. He built a massive network of underground tunnels beneath his estate, miles of them. They were wide enough for a carriage. He would ride his carriage through the tunnels so he could leave his house and get to the train station without the neighbors seeing him. He had a vanishing room in his house, a trap door he could jump through if a servant entered unexpectedly. When he was ill, his doctor had to stand outside the door and shout questions through the keyhole. The Duke wouldn't let him in. But here is the weirdest part. He required all his employees to ignore him. If a housemaid saw him in the hallway, she was ordered to pretend he wasn't there. If she made eye contact, she was fired. He was the ghost of his own house. But he loved roast chicken. That was his one joy. He would eat a roast chicken alone in his room. Then he would put on 3 pairs of trousers, a massive coat, a wig, and a top hat, and go scurry through his tunnels like a heavily dressed mole. When he died, they found thousands of letters in his room. Most of them were just notes to himself about chicken. It's a quiet, sad, bizarre life. He had all the money in the world, and he spent it digging a hole to hide in. And honestly, sometimes when the world is loud, you can kind of understand the appeal of a private tunnel. Just a long, dark, quiet place where no one can ask you anything. We're going to leave the Duke in his tunnel. We're going to float towards the end of our journey soon, but not yet. We still have to talk about the inventors, the men who built wings and jumped off towers, the men who built submarines and forgot to add air vents. The history of invention is basically a list of people saying, "I wonder what happens if I pull this lever," and then immediately regretting it. We'll cover the tragic comedy of bad engineering in the next part. For now, just picture the Winchester house, the stairs going up into the dark ceiling, the door opening to the night air, the silence of the hammers. Safe in your bed, no ghosts, no tunnels, just sleep.
He once shook hands with a branch of an oak tree in Windsor Great Park and had a long conversation with it, believing it was the King of Prussia. Honestly, considering the state of European diplomacy, the tree was probably a better conversationalist.
The cure for his madness was worse than the disease. His doctors, the Willises, were brutal. They believed in breaking the patient. They put the King of England in a straitjacket. They gagged him to stop him from talking. They blistered his skin with caustic powders to draw out the humors. They locked him in a chair famously called the no-restraint chair, which was basically an iron torture device. Imagine being the most powerful man in the world, the king of an empire, and you are tied to a chair in a cold room while your doctors mock you. His sons, especially the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, were awful. They basically celebrated his illness because it meant they could take power. They threw parties while their dad was screaming in the next room. There is a heartbreaking story from his later years. By 1810, George was blind and deaf. He was permanently locked away in Windsor Castle. He had a long white beard. He lived in a world of his own hallucinations. He spent his days playing the harpsichord. He would play the same few notes over and over again, humming to himself. He thought he was talking to his dead children, specifically his favorite daughter, Princess Amelia, whose death had triggered his final collapse. He would wander the halls, a ghost in a purple dressing gown, talking to angels. The Queen, Charlotte, was terrified of him. She stopped visiting. He was alone with his keepers. He died in 1820. He had been king for 60 years, but he had been absent for the last 10. Just a shell of a man, lost in the fog of his own broken chemistry. It's the ultimate loss of control. You can own armies, you can own colonies, but if your own brain decides to turn against you, you are powerless. So we have Cece, trapped in her corset and her beauty, and George, trapped in his straitjacket and his mind. Both of them royals, both of them prisoners. Let's float away from the palaces. They are too sad. The velvet is too heavy. Let's go somewhere brighter, but a scary kind of bright. We are going to New Jersey, the 1920s, the roaring 20s, jazz, flappers, gin. We are going to a factory, the United States Radium Corporation. Inside, there are rows of young women. They are sitting at workbenches. They're painting watch dials. This was a good job. It paid well. The girls were proud to be there. They were painting the numbers on watches with a new magical substance called undark. It was glow-in-the-dark paint made with radium. Radium was the miracle element. Marie Curie had discovered it. People thought it was healthy. They put radium in water, in toothpaste, in chocolate. They thought it gave you vitality. The girls in the factory were told the paint was harmless. To get a fine point on their brushes, the girls were taught a specific technique: lip, dip, paint. Put the brush in your mouth to shape the tip. Dip it in the radium paint. Paint the number. Repeat, hundreds of times a day. They were swallowing radium every single day. The girls loved the glow. They were called the ghost girls. After a shift, they would glow in the dark. They would paint their nails with the radium for fun. They would sprinkle the dust in their hair so they would sparkle at dance halls that night. They were literally painting themselves with death. It took a few years, but then the horror started. It started with their teeth. Their teeth would just fall out. No pain. They would just come loose. Then their jaws would swell. The bone would start to disintegrate. One dentist pulled a tooth from a girl, and a piece of her jawbone came out with it. The bone was honeycombed. It was moth-eaten. The radium was settling in their bones. It was emitting radiation from the inside out, destroying the calcium. Their legs broke just from walking. They developed massive tumors. And the company? The company knew. The scientists at the factory wore lead aprons and used tongs, but they told the girls it was safe. When the girls started dying, the company claimed they had syphilis to ruin their reputations and avoid paying them.
It is a story of such profound betrayal. These were young women, 18, 19, 20 years old. They just wanted to help their families. They wanted to buy nice dresses. And they were slowly dismantled by the element they thought was magic. The lawsuit they filed changed labor laws forever, but it was too late for them. They died in agony. And here is the most haunting part. They are still glowing. If you go to their graves today with a Geiger counter, it will click. Their bones are still radioactive. They will be radioactive for thousands of years. They are eternal in the worst possible way. So, let's visualize the glow, a soft green luminescent light. It looks peaceful, it looks like fireflies, but it is cold, it is silent. Drift with that image, the green light fading into the black earth, the silence of the watchdials ticking in the dark. We have time for one more brief stop in this segment. A palate cleanser? No, that's the wrong word. A digestive aid. Let's talk about Tare. We are in France in the late 1700s, a time of revolution and hunger, but no one was as hungry as Tare. Tare was a young man who had an appetite that was bottomless. He wasn't fat. In fact, he was incredibly skinny. His skin hung loose on his frame, but he could eat his own body weight in food in a single day. He started as a street performer. He would swallow corks, stones, live animals. He would eat a basket of apples in a row. The army recruited him, not as a soldier, but as a curiosity. The generals thought, hey, this guy can swallow anything. Maybe he can be a spy. Their brilliant plan was to give Tare a secret message, put it inside a wooden box, and have him swallow the box. Then he would cross enemy lines into Prussia, poop out the box, and deliver the message. It was a terrible plan. Tare swallowed the box. He crossed the lines, but he was caught almost immediately because he didn't speak German and he was frantically looking for food in garbage cans. The Prussians found the box. The message was just a test note asking if the box came out okay. The Prussians beat him up and sent him back. Tare begged the doctors to cure him. He hated his hunger. He was miserable. The doctors tried everything: tobacco pills, wine vinegar, soft-boiled eggs. Nothing worked.
The end of Edward's life was gruesome. The doctors, desperate to save the king and their own jobs, tried everything. They tried arsenic. They tried strange pastes. One female physician was brought in who allegedly tried to cure him with a mixture of herbs that just made him swell up and turn black. It was agony. He was 15 years old. He lay in his bed at Greenwich Palace, coughing his lungs out, while outside his door, the sharks were circling. His advisors weren't worried about the boy dying. They were worried about who would succeed him. They were plotting to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne to keep their own power. They were drafting wills. They were arguing. Meanwhile, the boy just wanted it to be over. His last words were a prayer for peace. And then he was gone. He ruled for 6 years. He died at 15. He never fell in love. He never went to war. He never really lived. He was just a placeholder between two much more famous queens, a brief, sad interlude of Latin homework and coughing. Let's leave the damp sadness of Tudor England. Let's float east, far east. We're going to a place where the winters are colder, the palaces are draftier, and the childhood trauma is turned up to 11. We are going to Moscow, to the Kremlin. We are going back to the 1530s, roughly the same time Edward was being born. But this is a very different world. This is the world of Ivan IV. You know him as Ivan the Terrible. But before he was terrible, he was just Ivan, a 3-year-old boy whose father, the Grand Prince, died suddenly from a boil on his leg, or poison. It's always maybe poison. So, Ivan is 3. He's the Grand Prince of Moscow. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, rules as regent. She's tough. She fights off the boyars, the Russian nobles, who want to take over. But 5 years later, when Ivan is 8, she dies too, almost certainly poisoned this time. So now we have an 8-year-old orphan alone in the Kremlin. This is where the terrible part starts to form. The boyars, specifically the Shusky and Belsky families, didn't respect the little prince. They took over the palace. Ivan later wrote about this time. He remembered that he and his deaf-mute brother, Yuri, were treated like garbage. The boyars would ignore them. They would forget to feed them. Ivan recalled often being hungry, searching the palace for food. Imagine the Grand Prince of Moscow, the future Tsar, sneaking into the kitchen to steal a crust of bread because the nobles were too busy partying to feed him. The boyars would sit with their muddy boots on his father's bed. They would mock him. They would kill his friends. If Ivan liked a servant or tutor, the boyars would have that person arrested or killed just to show Ivan who was boss. Ivan learned a very specific lesson from this. Power is violence, and trust is for idiots. He grew up in a dark, candlelit world of whispers and murder. He developed a cruelty that was creative. As a teenager, he would climb the palace ramparts and drop dogs and cats to their deaths just to watch them fall. It was a red flag the size of a tapestry. At 13, he finally snapped. He decided he was done being pushed around. He was at a dinner. Royal dinners are always where the drama happens. He stood up and accused Prince Andrei Shusky, the head of the boyar clan, of mishandling the government. The boyars laughed. "Sit down, kid." Ivan didn't sit down. He gave a signal. His kennel master entered the room with a pack of hunting dogs. Ivan ordered the dogs to seize Shusky. They did. It was messy. The boyars weren't laughing anymore. From that day on, Ivan was in charge. He was 13, and he had learned that the only way to be safe was to be the scariest person in the room. But we aren't here for the torture and the reign of terror. That's too loud. We are here for the quiet sadness of the background. Ivan's personal life was a desperate search for stability that he never found. He wanted a family. He wanted the one thing he didn't have as a kid, safety. He decided to get married. He held a bride show. This was a thing the Tsars did. They sent out a call, "Bring me all the eligible noble daughters." Hundreds of girls were brought to the Kremlin. They were paraded in front of Ivan. He walked down the lines looking for a wife. He chose Anastasia Romanova. By all accounts, he actually loved her. She was the one person who could calm him down. When he was having one of his fits of rage, she would just put her hand on his arm, and the terrible would fade away. They were happy. For 13 years, things were okay. But you know the pattern. Anastasia got sick. She grew weaker and weaker, and then she died. Ivan was broken. He was convinced the boyars had poisoned her, and modern forensic analysis of her hair actually shows high levels of mercury, so he was probably right. At her funeral, Ivan had a complete breakdown. He was howling. He had to be physically held back from throwing himself into the grave. After that, the last bit of light went out in Ivan's brain. He went full supervillain. He married 6 or 7 more times. The church stopped counting, but none of them mattered. He was just trying to replace Anastasia, and he couldn't. One wife died 2 weeks after the wedding. Another was drowned. Another was sent to a nunnery. It was a revolving door of misery. The saddest story involves his son, also named Ivan. Ivan Jr. was the heir. He was strong. He was capable. He was the one thing Ivan the Terrible was proud of. But one night in 1581, the Tsar walked into his daughter-in-law's room. She was pregnant. He decided she was dressed immodestly. She was probably just wearing a robe because she was pregnant and uncomfortable. Ivan started yelling at her. He started beating her. His son, Ivan Jr., heard the screams. He ran in. "Father, stop! You are hurting her."
Ivan the Terrible turned on his son. He had his iron-tipped staff in his hand, the staff he used to pound the floor when he was angry. He swung it. He hit his son in the temple. The prince fell. The room went silent. Ivan realized what he had done. He dropped the staff. He fell to his knees. He grabbed his son, trying to stop the bleeding. "May I be damned! I have killed my son! I have killed my son!" The younger Ivan lay in a coma for a few days, then died. The Tsar had killed his heir. He had killed the future of his dynasty. He spent the rest of his life wandering the palace halls at night, howling at the moon, scratching at the walls, a lonely, mad old man who had destroyed the only things he ever loved. It's heavy, it's dark, but it's also very quiet now. The screaming is over centuries ago. Now it's just dust in the history books.
Let's leave the Kremlin. It's too cold there. The ghosts are too loud. Let's float away to somewhere completely different, somewhere warmer, somewhere with better food, but just as much dysfunction. Let's go to Egypt, not ancient Egypt. We're talking about the 19th and 20th centuries, the dynasty of Muhammad Ali, the Pasha, not the boxer. Specifically, let's look at King Farouk. Farouk is a fascinating study in excess. He was the last king of Egypt, and if Edward VI was the boy who was scrubbed too much, Farouk was the boy who was spoiled too much. He came to the throne at 16. He was handsome, he was thin, he was charming. The people loved him. They called him the beloved king. But Farouk had a hole inside him that he tried to fill with stuff. He had a shopping addiction that makes modern influencers look like monks. He bought everything. He bought cars. He bought palaces. He bought the world's largest collection of pornography. He bought the world's largest collection of paperweights. Why? Who knows? But his favorite thing to collect was stolen goods. Farouk was a kleptomaniac. He was the king. He could have anything he wanted, but he liked the thrill of stealing. He took lessons from a professional pickpocket. He would go to diplomatic dinners and steal watches from visiting ambassadors. Imagine the scene, a fancy state dinner. The British ambassador reaches for his pocket watch, and it's gone. And the king of Egypt is sitting there, smiling, with a faint ticking sound coming from his pocket. One time he stole a pocket watch from Winston Churchill. Churchill, the man who led Britain through the war. Farouk swiped his watch during a meeting. He later found it and gave it back, claiming it had fallen on the floor. Churchill knew. Everyone knew. But it wasn't just funny, it was pathological. He ate and he ate and he ate. He went from the handsome, beloved king to a man who weighed nearly 300 pounds. He would eat 600 oysters a week. He would drink gallons of soda. He was eating his feelings, and his feelings were apparently, I am the last monarch of a dying system, and I don't know what to do. He kept a red Ferrari, but he painted it red himself? No. He passed a law that only he was allowed to drive a red car. If anyone else in Egypt had a red car, the police would confiscate it. He wanted to be the only red blur on the streets of Cairo. He would drive around at night, honking his horn, throwing water balloons at people. Just a giant, sad child with a crown and a car. In the end, he was overthrown. The military coup happened in 1952. Farouk didn't fight. He just asked to pack his things. He packed 200 crates of personal items. He got on his royal yacht, the Medusa, and sailed away into exile. He ended up in Italy, and he did exactly what you would expect. He ate himself to death. In 1965, he was at a restaurant in Rome. He ate a massive meal, oysters, lobster, lamb, cake. He lit a cigar, and he slumped over. Heart attack at age 45. The waiter probably just thought he was sleeping. It's a tragic comedy, the boy who had everything but couldn't stop taking more until he literally burst. So, take a moment to digest that. The cold austerity of Edward VI, the violent tragedy of Ivan the Terrible, the gluttonous excess of King Farouk. 3 boys who were given the world and found out it was too heavy to carry. We're going to float on. We have plenty of time left. The night is young, even if the history is old. Let's drift towards the bizarre world of royal pets, because if you think the humans were weird, wait until you meet the animals they kept in their bedrooms. We'll start with a wombat, a very specific wombat, belonging to a pre-Raphaelite poet, but connected to the weird bohemian circles of Victorian London. Actually, no, let's stick to royals. Let's talk about the Mad King of Bavaria, Ludwig II, and his imaginary dinner parties. Ludwig is the perfect bedtime story character. He built fairy tale castles. The Disney castle is based on his castle, Neuschwanstein. But Ludwig didn't build it for tourists to take selfies in front of. He built it as a stage set. Ludwig hated being a king. He hated politics. He hated war. He hated the Prussians. What he loved was opera, specifically the operas of Rocket Wagner. He loved the idea of Germanic legends, swans, knights, holy grails. He decided that if reality wasn't going to be a magical opera, he would just build his own reality. So, let's float to the Bavarian Alps. The snow is falling on the turrets of a white stone castle. It's quiet. It's the middle of the night, which is exactly when our next subject, King Ludwig II, was awake. He was a creature of the night. He slept during the day to avoid the sun and, more importantly, to avoid people. Ludwig is known as the fairy tale king. He's the guy who built Neuschwanstein, that white limestone fantasy perched on a cliff that looks like it belongs on a lunchbox. But Ludwig didn't build it for tourists to take selfies in front of. He built it as a stage set. Ludwig hated being a king. He hated politics. He hated war. He hated the Prussians. What he loved was opera, specifically the operas of Rocket Wagner. He loved the idea of Germanic legends, swans, knights, holy grails. He decided that if reality wasn't going to be a magical opera, he would just build his own reality. So, let's float to the Bavarian Alps. The snow is falling on the turrets of a white stone castle. It's quiet. It's the middle of the night, which is exactly when our next subject, King Ludwig II, was awake. He was a creature of the night. He slept during the day to avoid the sun and, more importantly, to avoid people. Ludwig is known as the fairy tale king. He's the guy who built Neuschwanstein, that white limestone fantasy perched on a cliff that looks like it belongs on a lunchbox. But Ludwig didn't build it for tourists to take selfies in front of. He built it as a stage set. Ludwig hated being a king. He hated politics. He hated war. He hated the Prussians. What he loved was opera, specifically the operas of Rocket Wagner. He loved the idea of Germanic legends, swans, knights, holy grails. He decided that if reality wasn't going to be a magical opera, he would just build his own reality. So, let's float to the Bavarian Alps. The snow is falling on the turrets of a white stone castle. It's quiet. It's the middle of the night, which is exactly when our next subject, King Ludwig II, was awake. He was a creature of the night. He slept during the day to avoid the sun and, more importantly, to avoid people. Ludwig is known as the fairy tale king. He's the guy who built Neuschwanstein, that white limestone fantasy perched on a cliff that looks like it belongs on a lunchbox. But Ludwig didn't build it for tourists to take selfies in front of. He built it as a stage set. Ludwig hated being a king. He hated politics. He hated war. He hated the Prussians. What he loved was opera, specifically the operas of Rocket Wagner.
He loved the idea of dramatic legends, swans, knights, holy grails. He decided that if reality wasn't going to be a magical opera, he would just build his own reality. So, let's float to the Bavarian Alps. The snow is falling on the turrets of a white stone castle. It's quiet. It's the middle of the night, which is exactly when our next subject, King Ludwig II, was awake. He was a creature of the night. He slept during the day to avoid the sun and, more importantly, to avoid people. Ludwig is known as the fairy tale king. He's the guy who built Neuschwanstein, that white limestone fantasy perched on a cliff that looks like it belongs on a lunchbox. But Ludwig didn't build it for tourists to take selfies in front of. He built it as a stage set. Ludwig hated being a king. He hated politics. He hated war. He hated the Prussians. What he loved was opera, specifically the operas of Rocket Wagner. He loved the idea of Germanic legends, swans, knights, holy grails. He decided that if reality wasn't going to be a magical opera, he would just build his own reality. So, let's float to the Bavarian Alps. The snow is falling on the turrets of a white stone castle. It's quiet. It's the middle of the night, which is exactly when our next subject, King Ludwig II, was awake. He was a creature of the night. He slept during the day to avoid the sun and, more importantly, to avoid people. Ludwig is known as the fairy tale king. He's the guy who built Neuschwanstein, that white limestone fantasy perched on a cliff that looks like it belongs on a lunchbox. But Ludwig didn't build it for tourists to take selfies in front of. He built it as a stage set. Ludwig hated being a king. He hated politics.
Just take a moment to visualize that. A horse coming out of a neck. It is possibly the most chaotic history. Why a horse? Well, remember, Poseidon is the god of horses, so genetically, I guess it tracks, in a very loose mythological sense. So now on this quiet beach, you have a dead Gorgon, a giant guy with a gold sword, and a flying horse shaking off the afterbirth and whinnying at the moon. The noise woke up the sisters. Steno and Uriel sat up. They saw their sister dead. They saw these two random new guys standing there, and they saw, well, they didn't see Perseus because he was invisible, but they sensed him. They smelled the blood. They heard the whoosh of the winged sandals. They were furious. They let out a scream that cracked the stones on the beach. They spread their golden wings and took to the air, scanning for the murderer. Perseus didn't stick around to hand out cigars for the new babies. He grabbed Medusa's head, carefully, without looking at the eyes, and shoved it into the kibisis, the magic silver bag. He pulled the drawstring tight. Then he ran, or flew, rather. He shot up into the sky. Steno and Uriel were right behind him. They were immortal hunters. They were fast. They were screaming in rage. But the helm of darkness was doing its job. They couldn't see him. They could only follow the disturbance in the air. Perseus flew as fast as he could, heart pounding, adrenaline spiking. He dodged through clouds. He banked around thunderheads. The sisters chased him for miles, their brass claws snapping at empty air, just missing his heels. Eventually, they lost the trail. They circled back, mourning their sister. The ancient poets say the sound of their wailing was so unique, so hauntingly beautiful and terrifying, that Athena later invented the flute just to mimic the sound, which is a very Athena thing to do. I helped kill your sister, but hey, nice melody. I'm going to put that on my mixtape. Perseus was safe. He was alone in the sky, high above the ocean. He had the bag, he had the head. The mission was accomplished. But he wasn't home yet. He was way out west. He had to fly all the way back to Seriphos to give the head to Polydectes. And because GPS hadn't been invented yet, his route was a little meandering. He flew south first, over the continent of Africa, specifically over Libya. Now, the magic bag was good, but it wasn't essentially Tupperware. It leaked. As Perseus flew over the sands of the Libyan desert, drops of Medusa's blood dripped from the severed head, seeped through the fabric of the bag, and fell onto the sand below. Every drop of blood that hit the hot desert sand turned into a venomous snake. This is the mythological explanation for why there are so many snakes in Africa. It wasn't evolution. It wasn't climate. It was Perseus having a leaky bag. He was basically crop dusting the continent with vipers. Oops, sorry about that. My bad. He just kept flying, leaving an ecological disaster in his wake. He flew on. The sun began to set. He was getting tired. Flying with winged sandals requires a lot of core strength. He needed a place to crash for the night. He spotted a massive mountain range, or what looked like a kingdom, in the distance. This was the realm of Atlas. Atlas was a titan. He was one of the old guard who fought against Zeus and lost. His punishment was to stand at the western edge of the world and hold up the sky. Literally, he had the celestial sphere resting on his shoulders. It was a heavy job. He was grumpy, he was tired, he had chronic back pain. Perseus lands in Atlas's garden, and it was a nice garden. It had the golden apples of Hesperides growing there. Atlas was very protective of these apples because there was a prophecy, there's always a prophecy, that a son of Zeus would one day come and steal them. So Perseus lands. He takes off his invisibility helmet. He walks up to this giant titan who is sweating under the weight of the cosmos. Perseus, not reading the room, introduces himself. "Greetings, I am Perseus. I am a son of Zeus. I need a place to sleep and maybe some snacks." He literally led with, "I am a son of Zeus," the one thing Atlas didn't want to hear. Atlas looked down. He saw this scrawny kid, and he remembered the prophecy about his apples. He didn't see a tired traveler. He saw a thief. "Get out," Atlas rumbled. "You are not welcome here. Go away before I squash you." Perseus was offended. He was technically a hero now. He had killed a Gorgon. He demanded hospitality. In ancient Greece, hospitality, xenia, was a big deal. You don't just turn people away. Atlas didn't care about social norms. He was a titan. He tried to physically shove Perseus out of the garden. Perseus realized he couldn't fight a titan. Atlas was the size of a mountain. A sword wasn't going to do anything. But then, Perseus remembered what he had in his bag. He thought, well, if you won't give me shelter, I'll give you a rest. He turned his face away. He reached into the bag. He pulled out the head of Medusa. He shouted, "Look!" Atlas looked. It was instantaneous. The giant titan, holding up the sky, looked into the dead gray eyes of Medusa. The curse still worked. Even after death, her gaze was potent. Atlas's skin turned to gray rock. His beard and hair became forests. His shoulders became cliffs. His bones became boulders. He grew and solidified until he was no longer a person, but a mountain range. The Atlas Mountains. The sky settled down on the new peaks. Perseus put the head back in the bag. He probably thought, well, now he doesn't have to hold the sky up with his arms anymore. I basically did him a favor. It was a very destructive way to interact with the landscape. Perseus was essentially terraforming the world by accident and by anger. He took off again. He didn't stay the night. Sleeping on a mountain that used to be a guy was probably too weird even for him. He headed back into the air, drifting over the Mediterranean, looking for the way home. So, let's recap the body count so far. One innocent priestess turned monster, then assassinated in her sleep. 2 weeping immortal sisters, an entire desert filled with venomous snakes, and a titan turned into a geological feature. Perseus is really racking up the collateral damage, and he hasn't even saved the princess yet. Because of course, there is a princess. There is always a princess. As Perseus was flying over the coast of Ethiopia, or Joppa, depending on the map, he looked down and he saw something strange. He saw a woman chained to a rock at the edge of the sea. This wasn't a sculpture. She was moving, she was crying, and the waves were crashing around her ankles. Perseus slowed down. He hovered. He adjusted his sandals. He thought, well, that looks like a situation that requires a hero, and I have a bag with a head in it, so I am definitely overqualified for whatever is happening here.
She started going into labor. The local doctor, John Howard, was called. He delivered parts of a rabbit, then a cat's leg, then more rabbit parts. Dr. Howard, instead of saying, "Okay, this is clearly a hoax," said, "By Jove, a medical miracle." He wrote to the king's doctors in London. He sent them samples. "Look at this rabbit leg. It came out of a woman." The king's anatomist, Nathaniel St. Andre, came down to investigate. He watched Mary Toft give birth to another rabbit. He was convinced. He wrote a pamphlet called A Short Narrative of an Extraordinary Delivery of Rabbits. The whole country went insane. People stopped eating rabbit stew. The king, George I, was fascinated. He had Mary Toft brought to London. They put her in a nice bathhouse in Leicester Fields. Crowds gathered outside. They wanted to see the rabbit woman. But now that she was under strict observation, and specifically now that she couldn't sneak any more dead animal parts into her room, the births stopped. The doctors waited. No rabbits. Finally, a porter was caught trying to sneak a small rabbit into her room. The jig was up. Mary Toft confessed. She admitted that she had been inserting the rabbit parts manually. I will spare you the details because this is a relaxation script, not a body horror movie, but let's just say it required a lot of commitment to the bit. Why did she do it? Money, fame. She was a poor peasant woman who saw a way to become the center of attention, and for a few months she fooled the smartest men in England. It destroyed the reputation of the doctors who believed her. They were mocked mercilessly. Pamphlets were drawn showing doctors chasing rabbits. It was the 18th century equivalent of being cancelled. Mary Toft was sent to prison for a bit, but then released. She went back to Godalming. She died years later, a local curiosity. It just goes to show that people will believe anything if it's weird enough, and if a doctor in a big wig says it's true, well, it must be true. So we've had a fake emperor who was loved and a fake rabbit mother who was ridiculed. The line between eccentric and fraud is very thin, and it usually depends on whether you are asking for money or just for a salute. Let's drift away from the rabbits. Let's go somewhere quieter, somewhere dusty. Let's go to a house in New York City, Harlem specifically. The year is 1909. We are standing outside a brownstone mansion. The windows are shuttered. No one has been seen going in or out for years. The neighbors whisper that it's full of garbage. This is the home of the Collier brothers, Homer and Langley. Now, hoarding is a reality TV show today, but the Collier brothers were the OGs of hoarding. They were the Michelangelos of clutter. They came from a wealthy family. Homer was a lawyer. Langley was a concert pianist. They were educated, refined gentlemen. But something in their brains just clamped shut. They became paranoid. They were afraid of burglars. They were afraid of the changing neighborhood. They retreated into their house and they locked the door, and they never opened it again. Over the decades, they filled the house, not just with trash, with everything. They collected newspapers every single day. Langley believed that one day, Homer, who went blind, would regain his sight and he would want to catch up on the news. So he saved every newspaper for 30 years so Homer could read them later. Stacks of papers reached the ceiling. They formed tunnels. The brothers navigated their own home through narrow burrows carved into the junk. They had 14 pianos. Why 14? We don't know. They had a Model T Ford chassis in the dining room. They had thousands of books. They had pickled human organs in jars. Their dad was a doctor. They set booby traps, tripwires made of bundles of newspapers and rope, designed to collapse on anyone who tried to break in.
Langley was the caregiver. He would sneak out at night, walk miles to get food, usually stale bread and peanut butter, and sneak back in. He would feed his blind, paralyzed brother Homer. It was a fortress of solitude built out of New York Times back issues. In 1947, a neighbor called the police. They smelled something bad. The police arrived. They couldn't get in. The front door was blocked by a solid wall of newspapers. They had to use ladders to climb into a second-story window. It took them hours to navigate the maze. Finally, they found Homer. He was dead. He had died of starvation and heart failure. He was sitting in an alcove carved out of magazines. But where was Langley? The police started a massive manhunt. They thought Langley had fled. They searched the city. They searched other states. Meanwhile, workers were clearing the house. They threw out 120 tons of debris. 120 tons! 3 weeks later, 3 weeks, they found Langley. He was 10 feet from where Homer had died. He had been crawling through one of his tunnels to bring food to his brother. He had tripped one of his own booby traps. A massive stack of newspapers in a suitcase had fallen on him and crushed him. He had died before Homer. Homer had died because Langley wasn't there to feed him. They died together, buried in the fortress they built to keep the world out. It's tragic, yes, but it's also quiet. Just imagine the silence in that house before the police came. The dust motes dancing in the slivers of light, the smell of old paper, the feeling of being completely insulated from the outside world. It was a cozy, deadly cocoon. There is something sleep-inducing about the idea of hoarding. Not the mess, but the insulation. The idea of building a wall between you and the world, layer by layer, newspaper by newspaper, until the noise of the city is just a distant hum. We're going to leave the Collier brothers in their paper tomb. Let's float to one last stop for this segment. Let's go to the ocean, to a ship that never sinks because it's a ghost ship, the Mary Celeste. November 1872, the Atlantic Ocean. The weather is fine. The sea is calm. A British brig, the Dei Gratia, spots a ship drifting. The sails are set in a weird way. It's yawing back and forth. They hail it. No answer. They row over. They climb aboard. The ship is empty.
Perseus, guided by Hermes and Athena, flew off to find the Graiae. These were 3 sisters who lived in a cave in a land of twilight. They were born old. They had gray hair from birth, and in a horrifying display of resource scarcity, they shared 1 eye and 1 tooth between the 3 of them. Just picture that domestic situation. 3 old crones sitting in a dark cave, passing a single eyeball back and forth. It's my turn to see. No, you had it for breakfast. Perseus had to get the coordinates for the nymphs from them, and since he was now being coached by the gods of cunning and thievery, he didn't ask politely. He waited in the shadows. He watched them passing the eye. Sister A takes the eye out to pass it to Sister B. In that split second where the eye is in midair, Perseus swoops in and grabs it. Now the Graiae are blind. They start panicking. Where's the eye? Who has the eye? Perseus holds the eye hostage. Tell me where the nymphs are or I drop the eye in the dirt. It was mean. It was essentially bullying the elderly. But it worked. The Graiae, desperate to see again, gave him the directions. He gave them back their eye. Hopefully he wiped it off first and flew off. He found the nymphs. They were much nicer. They gave him the winged sandals, which he strapped on, the helm of darkness, which he put on his head, and the magic sack, which he slung over his shoulder. Now Perseus was fully kitted out. He looked ridiculous. He was wearing winged shoes and visibility helmet, carrying a mirror shield and a diamond sword, and holding a magic sack. He was a walking Swiss army knife of divine weaponry. He was finally ready to go to Sarpedon. He took off into the sky, flying over the ocean. The wind whipped past him. Below, the dark waves rolled. He flew further and further west, toward the edge of the world. The sun began to set. The air grew colder. The cheerful blue of the Mediterranean gave way to the gray, ominous waters of the deep ocean. He was approaching the Gorgon's lair. Let's just pause here and think about Medusa again. She has no idea any of this is happening. She doesn't know about the dinner party. She doesn't know about the shield or the sword. She's just sleeping, maybe having a nice dream about a time before the snakes. She has no idea that a heavily armed, invisible man is currently hurtling through the sky with the sole intention of cutting her head off to win a bet. The tragedy is tightening its noose, the hero is approaching, and the monster is just a sleeping victim waiting for the end. Perseus spotted the island in the distance, Sarpedon, a jagged rock jutting out of the sea. It looked unwelcoming. There were stone statues scattered around the beach, birds, seals, maybe a few unlucky sailors who had washed ashore. The statues were incredibly lifelike because they were life, frozen in terror. Perseus took a deep breath. He adjusted his shield, he checked his invisibility helmet, and he began his descent toward the sleeping Gorgons. This is where things get tense, or as tense as we allow things to get here. We aren't going to have a big action movie fight. We are going to have a slow, methodical, quiet assassination. But that's for the next part. For now, let's leave Perseus hovering in the air, silent and invisible, looking down at the dark shapes of the three sisters sleeping on the sand. The sound of the waves is loud, the wind is whistling, and down below, the faint, dry rattle of snake scales sliding against stone. Rest here for a moment. The journey has been long, the air is cool. The end is coming, but not just yet, just the waiting, the quiet, heavy waiting. The very quiet assassination and the horse in the neck. So here we are, the climax of the story, or what would be the climax in an action movie. In reality, it was much more of a stealth mission gone right. We are hovering over the island of Sarpedon. It is dark. The wind is howling a little bit, but mostly it's the sound of the ocean crashing against sharp, unforgiving rocks. Perseus is floating there in his winged sandals. He's invisible thanks to Hades' helmet. He's holding a shield that is polished to a mirror shine, and he is looking down on three sleeping figures, the Gorgons. Now, usually when you have a boss fight in a video game, the boss is awake, pacing around, maybe giving a monologue about how they're going to destroy the world. The Gorgons were not doing that. They were just napping. They were curled up on the sand, probably snuggled together for warmth because ocean breezes are chilly. Perseus had a problem, though. There were three of them, Steno, Euryalea, and Medusa. And from a distance, when everyone has wings and brass claws and snakes for hair, it's hard to tell who is who. It's not like they wore name tags. And remember, Steno and Euryalea were immortal. If Perseus tried to chop off Steno's head, the sword would probably just bounce off. She'd wake up cranky, and Perseus would be turned into a garden gnome before he could say sorry. He needed to hit the right target. Luckily, he had his divine support team. Hermes and Athena were hovering there too, invisible, whispering in his ear. Imagine having a GPS that also judges you. Athena points a finger, or whatever the divine equivalent is, and whispers, "That one, the one on the left, that's Medusa. She's the mortal one. Don't mess this up." Perseus drifted down. He had to be very careful. He couldn't look directly at them. Even sleeping, the curse might work. Or maybe he just didn't want to risk her waking up and making eye contact. So he turned his back to the sleeping sisters. He held up the shield. He watched the reflection. It must have been disorienting. Everything is reversed in a mirror. Left is right, right is left. He had to navigate his flight path while using only the backup camera, but if you hit the curb, you die. He hovered over Medusa. In the reflection of the bronze shield, he saw her face. Even with the snakes, even with the monstrous features Athena had given her, she looked peaceful. She was just sleeping. The snakes on her head were probably sleeping too, coiled up in little knots. Perseus raised the adamantine sword, or sickle, depending on which ancient pottery you look at. He lined up the shot in the mirror. He took a deep breath, and he swung. It was one clean stroke. There was no battle. There was no back-and-forth banter. Medusa didn't get to defend herself. She didn't get to say a final word. She was murdered in her sleep by an invisible man she didn't even know existed. It was swift. It was efficient. It was profoundly sad. But then things got weird. Because this is Greek mythology, biology does not apply here. When Medusa's head was severed, she didn't just die, she gave birth. Remember that night in the temple with Poseidon? That was years ago, but apparently gestation periods for monsters are flexible, or maybe the curse kept things in stasis, we don't know. But the moment Medusa died, two beings sprang from her severed neck, fully formed. The first was Chrysoar. He was a giant warrior wielding a golden sword. He just popped out, ready to go. Hello, I have a sword. The second one is more famous. Out of the neck of the slain Gorgon flew a horse, a white-winged horse, Pegasus.
The unfortunate priestess and the sea bro god. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. Usually we're dredging up the deeply unfortunate genetic messes of the Habsburgs, or looking at why medieval royals were terrible parents. But tonight, we're going to drift all the way back to myth. Because honestly, the Greek gods were just as dysfunctional, petty, and biologically confused as any overly inbred 17th century monarch. They just had better PR departments and nicer statues. So find a comfortable spot, dim the lights down low, maybe grab a warm drink that doesn't have too much caffeine in it, because the goal here isn't to stay awake, it's to just float along with the story until you drift off. Let your shoulders relax, forget about your day. We are going to spend some time with someone who genuinely had a worse day than you did, a much worse life, actually. We're talking about Medusa. Now, everyone knows the end product: snake hair, stone glare, generally unpleasant to run into in a dark alley or really a well-lit garden. She's the ultimate monster poster girl, but she didn't start out that way. No one is born with a nest of vipers on their head, not even in Greek mythology, where people were born from thighs and sea foam. Medusa started out as just a person, a regular mortal person who happened to be very, very beautiful, which in ancient Greece was essentially a pre-existing condition for tragedy. Being beautiful when Zeus or Poseidon was nearby was like wearing a suit made of raw steak in a lion's enclosure. It was just asking for trouble. Let's float back to the very beginning, before the snakes, before the bad reputation. Medusa was born into a family that was already, let's say, deeply weird. Her parents were Perseus and Ceto. They were primordial sea deities, not the fun Little Mermaid kind of sea deities with clamshell bras and singing crabs. They were the deep, dark, pressurized ocean kind of deities. They were specifically the gods of the hidden dangers of the deep and sea monsters. That was their brand. They produced a lot of monstrous children. It was a living. So, Perseus and Ceto are down there in the crush depth, churning out various horrors, and they have 3 daughters. These are the Gorgons. 2 of them, Steno and Euryale, fit the family mold perfectly. They were immortal, they had brass hands, fangs, maybe some wings, depending on who you ask. They were very much on brand for their parents. They were the edgy art school kids of the Titan lineage. And then there was Medusa. Medusa was the anomaly. She was the oops baby who came out looking completely normal. She didn't have scales, she didn't have tusks, she was just a regular, mortal human woman. And not only was she normal, she was stunningly gorgeous. You can imagine the family dinners were awkward. Steno is sharpening her brass claws on the table leg, Euryale is complaining about shedding her winter scales, and Medusa's just there, trying to eat her soup and hoping nobody notices how smooth her skin is. She was the black sheep because she wasn't a monster. Because she was mortal, she had to figure out something to do with her life. She couldn't just hang around the deep sea vents forever waiting for her parents to retire. She needed a job, a calling. And because she was beautiful and wanted a quiet life away from her terrifying sisters, she decided to go into the priesthood. It seemed like a solid career path, stable hours, decent housing, lots of dusting statues. She became a priestess in the temple of Athena. Now, Athena is often billed as the goddess of wisdom, war strategy, and weaving, which is a strange portfolio, but fine. You would think working for the goddess of wisdom would be a smart move. You would think it would be safe. You would be wrong. Athena was also incredibly vain and deeply jealous, which seems counterintuitive for a wisdom goddess, but consistency wasn't really a big thing on Mount Olympus. She was one of those bosses who says their door is always open, but then gets mad when you actually walk through it. It was petty. So the vibe in the temple was already tense. Medusa was walking on eggshells, trying to be as bland and uninteresting as possible so her boss wouldn't smite her. It was a stressful working environment. And then it got worse, because let's float over to the ocean for a moment and introduce the real villain of this piece, Poseidon. Poseidon was the god of the sea, earthquakes, and horses. Another weird portfolio. Why horses? Nobody really knows. He just liked them. Poseidon was, to put it mildly, a problem. He was Zeus's brother, and they shared a lot of the same personality traits, mainly being incredibly entitled, deeply aggressive, and entirely incapable of understanding the word no. He was the ultimate sea bro. Poseidon caught wind of this beautiful priestess working over in Athena's temple. Now, Poseidon and Athena had a history. They didn't get along. They had a big rivalry over who got to...
But not in a we abandoned ship in a panic way, in a we just stepped out for a smoke way. There is food on the table, there are pipes filled with tobacco, the cargo, industrial alcohol, is intact, the lifeboat is gone, but the weather was good. Why would they leave? The captain's log ends abruptly. No mention of storms, no mention of sea monsters. They just left. Did they hallucinate from the alcohol fumes? Did they think the ship was sinking when it wasn't? Did a water spout scare them? We will never know. The ocean kept that secret. Just picture that empty ship, drifting in the middle of the vast blue Atlantic. The wheel is turning slightly with the waves. The silence of the empty deck. Creak, splash, creak, splash. No people, just wood and water and sky. Drift with that ship for a while. Let the rhythm of the waves rock you, back and forth, back and forth. The history of the world is full of people who disappeared, people who built walls, and people who wanted to be someone else. We are all just drifting. But you are safe in your bed. The walls are solid, the doors are locked, hopefully not with booby traps. You can let go. We'll float on to the next story in a moment, but for now, just watch the horizon. It's flat, it's calm, it's very, very far away. The empress who wore raw veal and the king who talked to trees. We are leaving the empty, silent deck of the Mary Celeste. We are leaving the vast, indifferent ocean. We are heading back to the stifling, velvet-lined corridors of European palaces. Specifically, we are going to Vienna in the late 19th century. If you thought the Spanish court was bad, wait until you meet the Habsburgs of Austria. Yes, them again. They are the gift that keeps on giving for sleepless historians. We are going to talk about Empress Elizabeth of Austria. You probably know her as Sisi. In the movies, Sisi is a fairy tale princess. She's young, she's beautiful, she falls in love with the Emperor Franz Joseph. It's all waltzes and crinolines. The reality was significantly more neurotic. Sisi was the Princess Diana of her day. She was arguably the most beautiful woman in Europe. She was famous for it. But for Sisi, beauty wasn't a gift. It was a full-time, grueling job that slowly drove her insane.
She was obsessed with her weight. She was 5'8", 172 centimeters, which is tall for the time, but she refused to weigh more than 110 pounds, 50 kilograms. She had a waist that measured 16 inches. That is the size of a large pizza. To maintain this, she basically starved herself. She lived on a diet of thin gravy, raw milk, and occasionally pressed juice made from raw duck blood, which sounds less like a diet and more like a potion you drink to become a vampire. She exercised compulsively. She had gymnasiums installed in all her palaces. She would spend hours doing gymnastics on rings and parallel bars, wearing full Victorian morning dress. Imagine walking into a gold-leafed palace room and seeing the Empress of Austria doing pull-ups in a black corset. But her main obsession was her hair. Sisi had hair that reached her ankles. It was incredibly thick and heavy. It was her trademark, but maintaining ankle-length hair in the 1800s was a nightmare. She had a personal hairdresser, Fanny Pfeifferlich, who was the most powerful woman in the court because she controlled the Empress's mood. Washing the hair took an entire day. They used a mixture of eggs and cognac. Sisi would sit there for hours, probably smelling like a very expensive omelet, while Fanny scrubbed. Daily brushing took 3 hours. Sisi would sit in a chair, draped in a white sheet, while Fanny brushed, and here is the kicker. Fanny had to present the brush to the Empress after every session. If there were any dead hairs in the brush, Sisi would have a meltdown. She would slap Fanny. She would scream. So Fanny learned a trick. She had a piece of sticky tape hidden under her apron. She would secretly stick the falling hairs to the tape so the brush would look clean. It was a daily act of espionage just to keep the Empress calm. Because her hair was so heavy, it gave Sisi terrible headaches. She often had to have it suspended from ribbons attached to the ceiling just to take the weight off her neck. Picture that image. The Empress of Austria, sitting in a dark room, her hair tied to the ceiling like a suspension bridge, sipping raw milk, miserable. She hated the court. She hated being stared at. She developed a fan language to hide her face. She would hide behind fans, parasols, and veils. She became a ghost in her own empire. She traveled constantly to escape Vienna. She loved the sea. She would sail through terrible storms. She actually had a tattoo of an anchor on her shoulder, a 19th century royal with a sailor tattoo. It was her way of saying, I belong to the ocean, not this stuffy palace. During storms, she would have herself tied to a chair on the deck so she could feel the waves crashing over her. She wanted to be like Odysseus. Her ladies-in-waiting were down below, vomiting and praying, while Sisi was up top, drenched in rain, laughing. Her end was as tragic as her life. In 1898, she was in Geneva, Switzerland. She was 60, but still starving herself, still corseted tight. She was walking to a steamboat. An Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini was there. He wanted to kill a royal, any royal. He originally wanted to kill the Duke of Orleans, but the Duke didn't show up. So Luigi checked the newspaper, saw Sisi was in town, and thought, she'll do. He ran up to her and stabbed her with a sharpened file. It was a tiny wound. Because Sisi was wearing a corset so tight it acted like armor, she didn't even realize she had been stabbed. She thought he had just punched her. She got on the boat. It wasn't until the boat started moving that she felt dizzy. She collapsed. Her lady-in-waiting opened her dress to give her air and saw the tiny, dried spot of blood. The file had pierced her heart, but the corset had held the blood in, keeping her alive for a few extra minutes. She died as she lived, restricted, beautiful, and fundamentally misunderstood. Let's leave the tragic Empress on the shores of Lake Geneva. Let's float north, across the Channel, back to England. But we're going back a bit further, to the late 1700s, to the court of George III. You know him as the king who lost America, the Mad King. But George wasn't a villain. He was actually a very boring, hard-working man. He liked farming. They called him Farmer George. He was faithful to his wife, Charlotte, which was almost unheard of for a Hanoverian king. He had 15 children. But George had a problem. possibly porphyria, a genetic blood disease, possibly bipolar disorder. We don't know for sure, but we know the symptoms. His urine would turn blue, and then the mania would start. The king would stop sleeping, he would start talking, and he wouldn't stop. He would talk for hours, days even, until his voice was a raspy whisper and foam formed on his lips. He would talk about everything and nothing.
He began to descend toward the woman. This is Andromeda, and her day was going about as well as Medusa's had. She was paying the price for her mother's vanity. It's a recurring theme. Mothers brag, daughters get chained to rocks. It's the circle of mythological life. But before we get into the romance, and I use that term very loosely, let's just float here in the air for a second. Let's appreciate the silence after the chaos. The Atlas Mountains stand silent and tall in the west. The snakes are slithering into the dunes in the south. The ocean is rolling endlessly below. And Medusa, the tragic figure who started all this, is just a trophy in a bag, bouncing against Perseus's hip as he flies. It's calm up here. The wind is steady. The clouds are soft. We're just drifting toward the next disaster. We'll land on that rock and meet Andromeda in the next part, but for now, just close your eyes and imagine the sound of wind rushing past golden wings. Smooth, steady, monotonous flight. The damsel, the deal, and the uncle who ruined the wedding. So, we are floating above the coast of Ethiopia, or maybe Joppa. The geography of mythology is extremely fluid, much like the ocean below us. We are looking down at a young woman chained to a rock. This is Andromeda, and she is currently having the worst day of her life, which is saying something, considering Medusa's day involved losing her head. Andromeda is there because her mother, Queen Cassiopeia, had a big mouth. Cassiopeia was the queen of this land, and she was very proud of her beauty, which is fine. Self-confidence is great, but Cassiopeia took it too far. She didn't just look in the mirror and say, "Lookin' good, Cass." She went down to the ocean and shouted, "I am more beautiful than the Nereids." Now the Nereids were the 50 daughters of the sea god Nereus. They were sea nymphs. They were famous for being beautiful and for having powerful connections. Specifically, they were friends with Poseidon. Some of them were even married to Poseidon. So, when Cassiopeia started bragging that she was hotter than the entire cast of the ocean's ruling class, the Nereids got offended. They went to Poseidon and complained, "Did you hear what she said? She said she's prettier than us. You have to do something." Poseidon, who we have established is petty, aggressive, and loves a reason to destroy things, was more than happy to oblige. He didn't just send a strongly worded letter, he sent a flood to devastate the kingdom. And, just to really drive the point home, he sent a sea monster, a Ceto, or Cetus. It was a giant, serpentine, whale-like dragon thing that started eating fishermen and destroying the coastline. King Cepheus, Andromeda's dad, was frantic. His kingdom was underwater, his people were being eaten, and his wife wouldn't stop checking her reflection. He did the standard king thing. He consulted the oracle of Ammon. The oracle, maintaining the 100% track record of giving terrible advice, said, "The only way to appease the sea monster is to sacrifice your daughter Andromeda. Chain her to a rock and let the monster eat her. Then Poseidon will chill out." It is a staggering escalation of consequences. Mom brags about her looks, so the daughter has to be fed to a Godzilla-sized fish? The logic is non-existent. But the king felt he had no choice. The people were demanding it. So they dragged poor Andromeda down to the cliffs, stripped her to the waist, and shackled her to the stone. Then they all retreated to the safety of the cliff top to watch. That is the scene Perseus flies into. He sees this beautiful woman crying in the surf. He sees the giant ripples in the water where the monster is approaching, and he sees the parents standing safely on a balcony in the distance, wringing their hands. Perseus lands on the rock next to Andromeda. He takes off his invisibility helmet, which must have been a relief because wearing a helmet in the sun is hot. "Excuse me," he says, "I couldn't help but notice you're chained to a rock. Is this a local custom, or are you in trouble?" Andromeda, through her tears, explained its situation. "My mom bragged. The monster is coming. I'm lunch." Perseus looked at her. He liked what he saw. He was a hero, yes, but he was also a single guy who had been living with his mom in a fishing hut for 20 years. He saw an opportunity. He didn't just cut the chains immediately. He flew up to the parents, King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia. "Hey," Perseus said, hovering in his winged sandals, "I can save your daughter. I can kill that monster, but I have a condition." "Anything," the king cried. "We'll give you half the kingdom." "I don't want the kingdom," Perseus said. "I want her. If I save her, I get to marry her, and I want to take her back to Greece with me." The parents looked at each other. They looked at the monster, which was getting very close to the rock. "Yes, fine, deal. Just kill the thing." They would have agreed to anything. They probably would have agreed to give him the moon. They just wanted the monster gone. So Perseus flew back down. The transaction was complete. Now he just had to do the pest control. The monster, Cetus, breached the water. It was massive, rows of teeth, slimy scales, the smell of rotting fish. It roared, eager for its royal snack. Perseus didn't use the Medusa head here. Maybe he was worried about accidentally petrifying Andromeda, or maybe he just wanted to show off his sword skills to his new fiancée. He swooped down. He used the advantage of flight. He was like a mosquito that bites you and you can't swat it, except this mosquito had an adamant sword. He danced around the monster's head. He stabbed it in the shoulder. He stabbed it in the back. The monster snapped and thrashed, splashing water everywhere, but Perseus was too fast. He dove, he slashed, he weaved. Eventually, he landed the killing blow. He drove the sword deep into the monster's spine. The beast gave a final shudder, groaned, and sank beneath the waves. The water turned red. The threat was gone. Perseus flew down, cut the chains, and caught Andromeda as she fell. "You're safe, and also we're engaged. Surprise!" Andromeda was probably just happy not to be eaten, so she went along with it. They went back to the palace. The king and queen were overjoyed. "You saved her! You saved the city! Let's have a wedding right now!" They threw a massive banquet. In the palace hall, everyone was drinking wine, eating roast meat, and cheering for Perseus. Incense was burning. Garlands of flowers were everywhere. It was a great party. Perseus was feeling good. He had the girl, he had the glory, he had the head of a gorgon in his bag under the table. But just as they were cutting the cake, or the ancient Greek equivalent, which was probably honey cakes, the doors of the banquet hall slammed open. In marched a man named Phineus. He was surrounded by a gang of armed soldiers. He looked furious. Phineus was the king's brother, so Andromeda's uncle, and because royal family trees are essentially wreaths, he was also Andromeda's original fiancé. Before the whole sea monster debacle, Andromeda had been promised to him.
Be the patron deity of Athens. Athena won that one with the olive tree, which was way more useful than Poseidon's gift, which was a saltwater spring. Who needs a saltwater spring in a city? It was just salty water. Thanks, Poseidon. So Poseidon was already sore about losing to Athena, and now he sees this gorgeous woman working in her temple. In his twisted, godly logic, he decided that pursuing Medusa would be a great way to get back at Athena, because gods see mortals not as people, but as pawns in their petty little squabbles. Poseidon shows up at the temple. It's probably late. Medusa is just trying to finish her shift, maybe locking up the donation box, and suddenly there's a major deity standing there smelling like low tide and entitlement. He makes his advances. Medusa obviously is terrified. She's a mortal priestess sworn to celibacy in the temple of a virgin goddess. Even if Poseidon wasn't a terrifying sea monster god, this was a massive HR violation. She refuses him. She tries to get away. She runs into the inner sanctum of the temple, right up to the statue of Athena, begging for protection. She did exactly what she was supposed to do. She sought sanctuary with her patron goddess. But Poseidon didn't care about sanctuary. He didn't care about rules. He was a god. He just barged right in. And right there, on the cold marble floor in front of the sacred statue of Athena, Poseidon assaulted Medusa. It was a horrific act of violence. And then he just left. He went back to the ocean, probably felt very pleased with himself, and went back to bothering dolphins or whatever he did down there. He faced zero consequences, because that's how it worked for the gods. Medusa was left there, traumatized, violated, in the temple she had devoted her life to. You would expect Athena, the goddess of wisdom, to appear and offer some comfort, maybe provide some divine counseling, maybe go yell at her uncle Poseidon for desecrating her temple. That is not what happened. Athena did appear, but she wasn't mad at Poseidon. She was furious at Medusa. In Athena's mind, Medusa had seduced Poseidon, because obviously, a mortal woman trying to do her dusting is entirely responsible for the uncontrollable urges of a billion-year-old sea god. The logic is staggering. Athena felt that her temple had been defiled, and since she couldn't punish Poseidon because he was her equal in power, she decided to punish the victim. It's the classic kick the dog scenario, only the dog is a traumatized woman and the kicker is an omnipotent deity with a chip on her shoulder. Athena looked at Medusa, shivering on the floor, and decided this was all her fault for being too pretty, especially in the hair department. So Athena decided to fix that. This wasn't a quick zap with a magic wand. This was a calculated dismantling of someone's identity. Athena focused on Medusa's pride and joy, her beautiful hair, the hair that everyone admired. Athena cursed her. You can imagine the sensation. It wasn't pleasant. The beautiful, silky strands of hair began to thicken. They started to writhe on their own. They changed color, turning a sickly green and brown. Scales formed. Little eyes popped open. Tongues started flicking out the air of the temple. Her hair turned into a tangled, hissing nest of venomous vipers. That would have been bad enough. Just having snakes for hair is a significant lifestyle change. Forget about hats. Forget about sleeping comfortably on a pillow. The snakes are probably always arguing with each other, hissing in your ears all day. It's a lot of background noise. But Athena wasn't done. She wanted to make sure Medusa was completely isolated. She wanted to make sure no one would ever look at Medusa with desire again. So she added the kicker to the curse. She made Medusa's face so terrifying, so profoundly awful to behold, that any living thing that looked directly at her would instantly turn to stone. It was the ultimate isolation vibe. Medusa went from being a beautiful woman surrounded by people to a monster who couldn't even make eye contact with a squirrel before killing it. She was fired, obviously. You can't be a priestess when you're turning the congregation into lawn ornaments. She was kicked out of the temple. She was kicked out of civilized society. She had nowhere to go. Well, almost nowhere. Her sisters, Steno and Euryale, the edgy, immortal ones, they took her in. They were like, well, you're finally one of us now. Welcome to the family business of being terrifying. They retreated to a remote island called Sarpedon, way out in the middle of nowhere, near the edge of the world, a place where no one would bother them, and more importantly, where no one would bother them. And this is where Medusa's life really settled into a long, quiet routine. She was living on a desolate island with her two immortal monster sisters. What do you do with your days in that situation? You can't garden, you'd petrify the plants. You can't keep pets, you can't have visitors. She probably spent a lot of time just walking on the beach, looking at the ocean, hating Poseidon. The snakes on her head would hiss at the seagulls. Maybe she tried to learn to knit without looking at what she was doing. It was a lonely existence. She wasn't hurting anyone out there. She was just existing, nursing her trauma and trying to manage her incredibly high-maintenance hair. She became a local legend, of course. Sailors would talk about the Gorgon Isle. Don't sail too close. Don't look at the shore. It became one of those places on the map marked, "Here be monsters."
He would sneak out of the hospital to fight stray dogs for scraps in the gutter. He was found drinking the blood of patients who were being bled. He was a monster to everyone else, But to himself, he was just suffering. He had a furnace inside him that burned everything and gave nothing back. He died of tuberculosis, the catch-all disease of the past. When they autopsied him, they found his stomach filled the entire abdominal cavity. His liver was enormous. He was biologically wired to consume. It's a gross story, sure, but it's also a lonely one. Imagine never being full. Imagine the panic of constant starvation, even while you were eating. So let's leave Tarar to his rest. Hopefully, where he is now, there is a banquet that never ends. The night is deepening. The history books are closing. The radium is glowing. The kings are sleeping in their straitjackets. The ships are drifting. You are safe. You are full. You are warm. Just let the stories float by like debris in a river. They don't touch you. They just pass. Next, we'll go to the 20th century eccentrics, the people who tried to cheat death. But that's for the next part. For now, just breathe. The vampire scientist and the man who turned blue. So we've washed the radium off our hands, hopefully, and left the hungry ghost of Tarar in the 18th century. We are moving forward into the 20th century, a time of science, progress, and people doing incredibly stupid things in the name of immortality. We promised to talk about cheating death, and if you're going to talk about that, you have to talk about Alexander Bogdanov. Bogdanov was a Russian polymath in the 1920s. He was a sci-fi writer, a Bolshevik revolutionary, and a doctor. He was convinced that he had found the secret to eternal youth. It wasn't a fountain, it wasn't a holy grail, it was blood. Bogdanov believed in parabiosis. Basically, if you take the blood of a young, healthy person and put it into an old, tired person, the old person will get younger. It's a very vampiric concept for a man who claimed to be a man of science. He started experimenting on himself. He performed 11 transfusions, and weirdly, it seemed to work, or at least the placebo effect was working overtime. His friends said he looked years younger. He claimed his eyesight improved. He stopped going bald. He was walking around Moscow with a spring in his step, probably feeling like he was going to live forever. But blood is tricky. This was before we fully understood all the complexities of blood types and diseases. In 1928, Bogdanov decided to do a transfusion with a student who had malaria and tuberculosis. Bogdanov thought he was immune. He thought his rejuvenated body could handle it. He was wrong. The transfusion went bad immediately. His body rejected the blood. He suffered a massive hemolytic reaction. His kidneys failed. He died in agony. The student, ironically, survived. The transfusion actually helped him. So Bogdanov technically saved a life, just at the cost of his own foolish quest for immortality. He died trying to become a vampire, defeated by biology. But if Bogdanov's story is a tragedy, the story of Paul Karason is just baffling. Let's jump forward to the late 19th century. Meet Paul. Paul was a regular guy who had some dermatitis, flaky skin, stress. He wanted a cure. He read somewhere that colloidal silver was good for you. Silver has antibacterial properties, true, but usually you put it on a bandage, you don't drink it. Paul decided to drink it. A lot of it. He made his own colloidal silver brew in his kitchen. He drank about 10 ounces of it a day, for years. Now, silver doesn't leave the body easily. It accumulates in the skin. And when silver is exposed to sunlight, it tarnishes, just like silverware. So Paul started to change color. He didn't turn green like the Hulk. He turned blue, a deep slate gray blue, like a Smurf, or a really grim statue. People would stare at him in the street. He became known as Papa Smurf. He went on talk shows. And the wildest part? He insisted it was good for him. He said he hadn't had a cold in years. Sure, Paul, you haven't had a cold, but you are blue. He lived the rest of his life as a blue man.
He died in 2013 of a heart attack unrelated to the silver. But he serves as a permanent reminder that just because you can make medicine in your kitchen sink doesn't mean you should. Let's float away from the medical disasters. Let's go to the desert, specifically the American West in the late 19th century. We are going to talk about pettiness. You might think teenage drama is intense, but it is nothing compared to the drama of two middle-aged paleontologists. This is the story of the Bone Wars. Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. These two men hated each other more than perhaps two people in the history of science. They started as friends. They even named species after each other. But then the betrayal happened. Marsh pointed out that Cope had reconstructed a dinosaur skeleton, the Elasmosaurus, with the head on the wrong end. He had put the skull on the tip of the tail. Cope was humiliated. He tried to buy up every copy of the journal where he published the mistake to destroy them. Marsh made sure everyone knew about it. The war was on. For the next 20 years, these two men rampaged across Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska. They were racing to find dinosaurs, but they weren't doing it for the love of science. They were doing it to beat the other guy. They bribed each other's dig teams. They stole bones. They threw rocks at each other. At one point, Marsh's team found a massive quarry of bones. When they were done excavating what they could carry, Marsh ordered them to blow up the rest with dynamite, just so Cope couldn't have them. They destroyed priceless fossils out of spite. They wrote articles in newspapers calling each other liars and thieves. They spent their entire fortunes trying to bankrupt each other. In the end, they both died broke and unhappy. Cope died in a small apartment surrounded by piles of bones he couldn't afford to store properly. Marsh died alone, alienated from everyone. But thanks to their hatred, we have the Triceratops, we have the Stegosaurus, we have the Allosaurus. They discovered over 130 species of dinosaurs just because they wanted to make the other guy look bad. It's the most productive temper tantrum in human history. Let's leave the dusty quarries of the Bone Wars. Let's go to a house, a very strange house. We're in San Jose, California. It's 1884.
Perseus demands to know who the father is. Danae honestly tells him it was Zeus. He came in as gold rain. Perseus didn't believe her. Or maybe he did, and that terrified him even more. If the father was Zeus, then killing the baby directly would be a great way to get struck by a lightning bolt. You don't just murder Zeus's kids. That's a fast track to a very crispy death. So Perseus was stuck. He couldn't kill the baby with a sword, but he still needed them gone. He needed a loophole, a way to kill them where he could plausibly deny responsibility. He chose the exposure to the elements route. It's the passive-aggressive way to commit homicide. He ordered a large wooden chest to be built. He put his daughter Danae and the newborn baby Perseus inside the chest. He probably gave them a loaf of bread and a flask of water, just to tell himself he was being humane. Then he nailed the lid shut, and he threw the chest into the ocean. His logic was, if they drown, it's Poseidon's fault, not mine. I just put them in a boat. A very bad boat with no oars or sails, but technically a boat. So now we have Danae and baby Perseus bobbing around in the Mediterranean Sea in a wooden box. It must have been terrifying for Danae. Pitch black, tossing and turning, the smell of salt water leaking in, holding a baby who was probably screaming his head off. They drifted for days, just floating. The currents took them east. They drifted all the way to the island of Seriphos. By pure luck, or maybe Zeus nudging the waves, the chest got snagged in the net of a fisherman named Dictys. Dictys was a good guy. He hauled the heavy chest onto the beach, pried open the lid, and found a very seasick princess and a baby. He took them in. He raised Perseus as his own foster son, and for a while things were actually calm. This is the quiet part of the movie where the kid grows up. Perseus grew from a baby in a box to a strapping young man.
He was strong, he was athletic, he was apparently very handsome. But he was also poor. He was the son of a refugee living in a fisherman's hut. He didn't have a kingdom, he didn't have an army, he just had his strength and his mom. But as always, there was a problem. The island of Seriphos wasn't run by Dictys, the nice fisherman. It was run by his brother, King Polydectes. And Polydectes was a creep. Polydectes saw Danae. Danae was still beautiful. Polydectes decided he wanted to marry her. Danae was not interested. She'd had enough drama with men in power, thank you very much. She just wanted to live quietly in the fishing hut. Polydectes kept pushing, but there was one obstacle in his way: Perseus. Perseus was now a grown man, and he was extremely protective of his mother. He was basically her bodyguard. Every time Polydectes tried to make a move, Perseus was there, flexing his demigod muscles and staring him down. Polydectes realized he couldn't just marry Danae while Perseus was around. He needed to get rid of the kid. But he couldn't just kill him because Perseus was strong and popular. He needed Perseus to leave voluntarily. He needed to trick him. So Polydectes hatched a scheme. It was a classic send the hero on a suicide mission plot. He announced a fake engagement. He told everyone he was going to marry a different woman, a princess named Hippodamia. He threw a massive banquet to celebrate this fake engagement. Now, in those days, if the king invites you to a banquet, you have to bring a gift. It's a potluck, but the stakes are higher. The custom was to bring a horse. Kings loved horses. Everyone on the island is invited. All the nobles show up with their best stallions. Perseus shows up too, but Perseus is a fisherman's foster son. He doesn't have a horse. He doesn't even have a pony. He has, like, a fishing net and some sandals. He stands there humiliated. The king, Polydectes, looks at him and asks, loudly in front of everyone, "Where is your gift, Perseus? Everyone else brought a horse. Are you too cheap to honor your king?" Perseus was young, he was proud, and he was not very smart. He felt the shame burning his cheeks. He wanted to prove he was just as good as any noble. So, in a moment of absolute stupidity, he shouted out, "I have no horse, but I will bring you any other gift you ask for. Name it, and I will get it. Even the head of the Gorgon Medusa." The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop, or an olive pit drop. Why did he say Medusa? Maybe he'd heard the sailors' stories. Maybe it was just the first scary thing that popped into his head. It was a ridiculous boast. It was like saying, "I don't have a toaster for your wedding, but I'll go to the moon and bring you a moon rock instead." Polydectes smiled. This was exactly what he wanted, a trap. "The head of Medusa?" the king said, raising an eyebrow. "That is a generous offer, Perseus. I accept. Don't bother coming back to the island until you have it." Perseus sobered up pretty quickly. He realized what he had done. He had just promised to kill a monster that turns people to stone just by looking at them. He had no map, he had no weapons that could hurt a monster, he had no idea where she lived. He left the banquet in a daze. He wandered down to the beach, looking at the ocean, probably thinking, "I am an idiot. I am a dead man." But the gods love a fool with a death wish. As Perseus was moping on the shore, kicking sand and regretting his life choices, he got some visitors. First, Hermes appeared, the messenger god. He's the guy with the winged sandals and the caduceus staff. He's basically the divine fix-it guy. He floats down and says, "Hey, heard you made a stupid promise. Need a lift?" And then Athena appeared. Now, remember Athena. She's the one who created Medusa in the first place. She's the one who cursed the poor priestess. You'd think she'd be over it by now. It's been years. Medusa is in exile. But no, Athena is the queen of holding a grudge. When she heard Perseus was planning to kill Medusa, she was absolutely delighted. She thought, finally, let's finish the job. So the gods decided to equip Perseus like he was a character in a role-playing game. They gave him the cheat codes. Athena gave him a shield. It was a polished bronze shield, shined to a mirror finish. She explained the mechanics. Listen, idiot, do not look at her. If you look at her, you turn to stone. Game over. Look at her reflection in the shield. It's a rear-view mirror for murder. That was good advice. Hermes gave him a sword, not just any sword, but an adamantine sword. Adamantine is the hardest substance in mythology. It's basically unbreakable diamond metal. You need something sharp to cut through snake scales and Gorgon neck muscles. But they weren't done. They told him he needed more gear. He needed the Stygian nymphs. These were some nymphs who guarded a few specific magical items that Perseus would need. The gods didn't just give him these items, they made him go on a fetch quest first, because nothing is ever easy. He needed 3 things from the nymphs: winged sandals, so he could fly. Serpedon, the Gorgon island, was way out in the ocean. You couldn't swim there. The helm of darkness. This was Hades' helmet. It made the wearer completely invisible, useful for sneaking up on monsters. And a cabesus. This is a fancy word for a magic wallet. A wallet, basically, but a really durable one. Because once you chop off a head that turns people to stone, you can't just carry it around by the snakes. You need a safety bag to put it in. The problem was only the Graii knew where the nymphs were. And this leads to the next stop in our tour of weird mythological figures, the Graii.
Decades passed, maybe centuries. Time gets weird in myths. Medusa just existed in her quiet isolation. She was a victim of a god's lust and a goddess's petty wrath, exiled to the edge of the world just to try and have some peace. She wasn't plotting world domination. She wasn't terrorizing villages. She just wanted to be left alone. But of course, in Greek mythology, if a monster is minding its own business on a remote island, some hero is eventually going to decide they need to go kill it to prove how manly they are. It's inevitable. It's the driving force of half these stories. A hero needs a trophy, and Medusa was just sitting there, waiting to become a quest objective. Let's just float here for a minute and consider the unfairness of it all before we introduce the guy who comes to ruin her retirement. Medusa's story is essentially one long series of unfortunate events caused by powerful people punching down. It's a tragedy wrapped in a monster movie setup. She's on her island, the snakes are hissing at the moon, and meanwhile, back on the mainland, a young man named Perseus is about to get roped into a very stupid family drama that's going to end very badly for Medusa. But that's a story for the next segment. For now, just picture the quiet island, the sound of the waves, and the gentle, rhythmic hissing of snakes. Perseus and the Golden Shower. Let's float away from Medusa's lonely snake-filled island for a while. We'll leave her there, listening to the surf and trying to keep her hair from biting her ears. We need to head back to the mainland, specifically to Argos, to meet the other half of this disaster equation, the so-called hero. Now, usually, heroes in Greek mythology are born from a combination of divine intervention and really poor decision-making. Perseus is the gold standard for this. His story begins with his grandfather, King Acrisius of Argos. Acrisius was one of those kings who was absolutely obsessed with his mortality. He was the type of guy who would check WebMD every time he sneezed. He was deeply insecure about his lineage because he didn't have a son. He only had a daughter named Danae. And in ancient Greece, if you were a king without a son, you basically felt like your 401k was empty. You had no succession plan. So, Acrisius did what all anxious kings do. He went to the oracle at Delphi. Now, if we've learned anything from history and myth, it's that going to an oracle is never a soothing experience. You never get a fortune cookie that says, "Lucky numbers, 4, 12, 18. You will have a pleasant Tuesday." No, the oracle is always bad news. Acrisius asks if he'll ever have a son.
The oracle, probably bored and looking to stir the pot, tells him, "No, you won't, but the bad news is your daughter Danae will have a son, and that son is going to kill you." Short, sweet, absolutely terrifying. Acrisius went home in a panic. He looked at his daughter Danae, who was probably just sitting there doing some embroidery or reading a scroll, completely innocent. But now, all Acrisius saw was a ticking time bomb that would eventually produce his assassin. Most rational people might try to just be a really nice grandfather so the kid wouldn't want to kill them, but Acrisius was a king, so rationality wasn't his strong suit. He decided the best way to prevent this prophecy was to ensure Danae never, ever had a child. He needed to keep her away from men, all men. His solution was extreme. He didn't just ground her, he built a subterranean bronze chamber, basically a panic room but buried underground. Some versions say it was a bronze tower, but a buried bronze room sounds much more claustrophobic and sleep-inducing, so let's go with that. He locked Danae inside this metal box, no windows, just a sliver of light from the roof so she wouldn't suffocate. He put guards outside. He thought, there, problem solved. Physics is on my side. No man can get through bronze walls. He forgot about the vertical axis, and he forgot about Zeus. We mentioned Zeus earlier. He's the king of the gods, and he has a serious boundary issue. He also has a thing for women who were locked up in impossible-to-reach places. It's like a challenge to him. He looked down from Mount Olympus, saw this bronze bunker, and thought, I wonder who's in there. He used his X-ray vision, or just divine intuition, and saw Danae. And of course, because this is a Greek myth, she was beautiful. Zeus decided to pay a visit, but he couldn't just walk in the front door because of the guards and the whole buried underground situation. So he had to get creative. He had to change his form. Now, usually, Zeus turns into animals, a swan, a bull, an eagle, but for this specific heist, he decided to turn himself into weather, specifically a shower of gold. I want you to just visualize that for a second. Danae is sitting in her dark bronze room, probably incredibly bored, counting the rivets on the wall. Suddenly, the roof opens up, or the light filters through, and it starts raining liquid gold. It pours down into her lap, and somehow, through the biology of mythology, which absolutely does not hold up to peer review, this golden rain impregnated her. It's weird, it's deeply metaphorical, it's very Zeus. So 9 months later, the impossible happens. In the silence of the bronze chamber, the sound of a crying baby is heard. Acrisius is walking by, feeling very secure in his child-proofing efforts, and he hears the wail of an infant. He freaks out. He storms into the chamber, which is probably very awkward given the lack of doors, and finds Danae nursing a baby boy. This is Perseus.
The servants, listening outside the door, would hear the king talking to himself for hours. It must have been spooky. Just the clink of silverware and the king's voice echoing in the empty gold-plated room. After dinner, Ludwig would go for a ride, but not a normal carriage ride. He had elaborate, gilded sleighs. He would wrap himself in furs, and he would go tearing through the snowy mountains at 2 a.m. He had electric lights installed on his sleigh, which was cutting-edge technology at the time, so the local peasants would just see a glowing blue streak flying through the dark forest. They thought he was a ghost or a wizard. He was just a lonely guy who wanted to pretend he was Lohengrin, the Swan Knight. But, as always, the real world intruded. Ludwig was spending money he didn't have. He was borrowing heavily. The Bavarian government was tired of it. They didn't care about the grotto or the swan boat. They cared about the budget. So they decided to get rid of him. They used the classic "he's crazy" defense. They assembled a panel of doctors who had never even examined him, and they declared him insane. A commission showed up at Neuschwanstein to arrest him. At first, Ludwig's local peasant friends protected him. They stood at the gates with pitchforks. They loved their weird night owl king. But eventually, the government agents got in. They took Ludwig to a smaller, more secure castle on the shores of Lake Starnberg.
They took away his doorknobs. They put bars on the windows. The next day, Ludwig went for a walk with his psychiatrist, Dr. Gooden. They walked down toward the lake. The guards were told not to follow. They never came back. A few hours later, the bodies of both the king and the doctor were found floating in waist-deep water. The official story was suicide by drowning, but Ludwig was a strong swimmer, and the water was shallow, and the doctor showed signs of a struggle. Did Ludwig try to escape? Did he kill the doctor and then have a heart attack? Did the government assassinate him? We don't know. It's a mystery. But it fits his life perfectly. He lived in a fantasy, and he died in a mystery. He walked into the water and just dissolved into legend. Neuschwanstein was never finished. If you go there today, it's beautiful, but it's a shell, a monument to a man who just wanted to stay up late, ride his sleigh, and not talk to real people. Honestly, a relatable mood. Let's leave the cold water of Lake Starnberg. Let's drift west, all the way to the New World, to a city that has always been a magnet for eccentrics, San Francisco. We are jumping back a few decades to the 1860s. The gold rush is over, but the city is still wild. And walking the streets of San Francisco is a man in a blue uniform with gold epaulets. He wears a beaver hat with a peacock feather. He carries a saber. He inspects the sidewalks. He checks that the police are doing their jobs. This is Joshua Norton, but you should address him by his proper title, Norton I, Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. Now, usually when someone declares themselves Emperor of a democratic republic, they get arrested or put in an asylum. But Joshua Norton was different. He was a tragedy that turned into a comedy. He had been a businessman. He came from South Africa with a fortune. He tried to corner the rice market in San Francisco. He bought all the rice. It was a bold move. It would have worked, except 2 ships full of rice from Peru showed up the next day. The price crashed, and Norton lost everything. His mind cracked. He disappeared for a while. He lived in a working-class boarding house. Then, one day in 1859, he walked into the office of the San Francisco Bulletin and handed the editor a piece of paper. It was a proclamation. At the peremptory request and desire of a large majority of the citizens of these United States, I, Joshua Norton, declare and proclaim myself Emperor of these United States. The editor thought it was funny. He printed it. He thought it would be a joke for a day. But San Francisco, in a moment of collective whimsy that defines the city to this day, decided to just go with it. Instead of mocking him, they adopted him. Norton I became a fixture. He issued executive orders. He fired Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln didn't notice. He dissolved Congress. Congress also didn't notice. He ordered a bridge to be built between San Francisco and Oakland. Everyone laughed at that one. A bridge? Impossible. The Bay Bridge stands there today, exactly where he said it should be. The city took care of him. When his uniform got ragged, the city council voted to buy him a new one. When he went to a restaurant, he ate for free. He would issue imperial bonds, basically IOUs, signed Norton I, and shops would accept them as currency. He was the mascot of the city, but he took it seriously. He wasn't playing a character. In his mind, he was the emperor. He went to churches every Sunday, a different denomination each week so as not to show favoritism. He would sit in the front row. The preachers would welcome him. There was a famous incident where an anti-Chinese riot was breaking out in the streets. A mob was forming. It was going to be violent. Emperor Norton stepped in front of the mob. He didn't have a weapon. He just stood there, bowed his head, and started reciting the Lord's Prayer. The mob, confused by this crazy old man in a peacock feather hat, stopped. They dispersed. He literally stopped a riot with the power of his own delusion. He lived this way for 21 years, a penniless man who was treated like royalty. When he died in 1880, He collapsed on the street corner. He had $5 in his pocket. But his funeral? It was fit for an emperor. 10,000 people lined the streets of San Francisco. The funeral cortege was 2 miles long. Rich people, poor people, business owners, laborers, they all came to say goodbye to the emperor. The headline in the newspaper read, "Le roi est mort." The king is dead. It's a sweet story. In a history of murdering uncles and inbred tyrants, it's nice to find a guy who just went mad and decided to be nice to everyone, and everyone was nice back. He's buried in Colma now. His gravestone says, Norton I, Emperor of the United States. And really, who are we to argue? Let's leave the cold water of Lake Starnberg. Let's drift west, all the way back across the Atlantic. We need to go back to the 18th century, to England, to a story that is not sweet. It is biologically confusing and slightly gross. We are going to Godalming, Surrey. The year is 1726. This is the story of Mary Toft, the woman who gave birth to rabbits. Yes, rabbits. Now, you are lying there, hopefully comfortable, thinking, that's not possible. And you are right. But in 1726, medical science was less medical machines and more, let's poke it with a stick and see what happens. Mary Toft was a poor woman. She was working in the fields. She claimed that she had been startled by a rabbit while she was pregnant, and this had impressed upon her unborn child.